Welcome to the first paradox. You walk down a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway, and you keep walking because there is no other choice but walking, and the floor stays firm and smooth beneath your feet. But the end never comes, and the door is always ahead, just close enough to see, but never far enough to stop, and you reach for the handle and open it and find yourself stepping into the next hallway, which looks the same but feels different, and you wonder if the change is in the hallway or in you, but then realize you have no memory of what you looked like when you started walking, and maybe you didn't look like anything at all, and maybe you were the hallway or the door or the act of walking. And as you pass through, again and again, each space is not the same hallway repeated, but a new hallway pretending to be the last one, but not quite pulling off the lie, and the lights flicker just slightly less than before, and the walls seem to shift just slightly more than you thought. And you wonder if it's your eyes or the hallway or the door or all of it at once, and you ask where the end is. But the asking loops back and becomes the start, and the start becomes a copy of the end. But the copy is more real than the original, and the original is now forgotten, and only the copies remain. You walk through a door that opens to a hallway where time doesn't move forward or backward, but still manages to pass, and you remember a hallway you've never seen, and forget one you just walked, and the doors become thinner but heavier, and the handles grow colder, though there is no temperature, and the floor begins to tilt, though you're always upright, and you suspect the hallway is tilting you, and not the other way around, and perhaps the hallway walks through you and not you through it, and the door opens, not because you pull the handle but because it decides it's time, and when it doesn't open you realize you are already through it, and when you try to turn around you realize there is no direction, and when you try to stop you realize stopping is just walking in place, and walking in place is falling forward slowly. You begin to believe the hallway is not a hallway, but a question, and the door is not a door, but an answer, and the answer leads to another question that leads to another answer that doesn't explain anything, and you want to sit, but there is no sitting in the hallway because there is no ground when you stop, and when you stop, you fall through the idea of the hallway and land back in it, exactly where you left, as if it missed you and didn't want you gone, and now the walls breathe when you aren't looking, and the lights hum in a language you almost understand, and you begin to wonder if the hallway is aware of your thoughts and changes itself slightly to keep ahead of you, and maybe it does, and maybe that's why you're still walking. You see a door that looks different and rush toward it, only to find it's exactly the same, and the difference was in your hope, and your hope was misplaced but also necessary, because without it, you wouldn't walk, and without walking, you wouldn't see the door, and without the door, you wouldn't hope. And now the hallway smiles, or maybe that's just a crack in the wall, but it feels like a smile, and you don't know how you can feel a hallway smile, but you do, and it feels old and patient and amused, and you start to count your steps, but forget the numbers and start again and again and again, until counting feels like praying, and praying feels like knocking, and knocking feels like waiting, and waiting feels like walking. You meet someone walking the other way, and you smile, and they smile, and you say hello, but they say it first, and you realize you are them, and they are you, and you are both walking in opposite directions while heading the same way, and when you turn to see them again, they are gone, and maybe you never met them, or maybe you still are them, or maybe you haven't met them yet. And now the hallway is slightly narrower, but only when you breathe. And if you hold your breath, it widens, but then the lights go out and only come back when you exhale, and now you must choose between space and light, and wonder if that's a choice or a trick. You start to walk faster, but the hallway walks faster too, and the door moves back, and you think maybe it is running from you, or toward you, or away from itself, and maybe you are the door, and the hallway is inside you, and you are chasing your own thoughts through endless rooms, and each time you think you understand it, slips just out of grasp and becomes a different idea that feels the same, and you call it progress, but the hallway calls it familiar, and the door laughs, but without sound. And that silence is louder than any sound, and it rings in your bones and shakes your thoughts loose. You wonder what you were doing before the hallway, but cannot remember a before. And maybe this is all there ever was, and maybe this is all there ever will be, and the hallway stretches and bends, but never breaks. And you wonder if it's bending around something or toward something, and maybe it's both, and maybe neither. And you touch the wall, and it feels like memory, and the door creaks open, and the air smells like a place you've never been, but miss terribly, and you take a step through and find the hallway again, waiting, but slightly darker, slightly quieter, slightly more you and less itself. You try to mark the wall to prove you've been here, but the mark fades the moment you move, and you try to drop something on the floor, but it's gone the next time you look, and maybe you didn't drop it, or maybe the hallway took it, or maybe the hallway is where all lost things go, and if you turned around, you'd find everything that ever disappeared sitting patiently behind you, but when you turn, there is only hallway, and only forward, and only door, and only now. You ask what happens if you stop walking and sit and wait, but time does not pass when you wait, and you become a still point in a moving hallway, and the hallway forgets you and begins to erode you gently like a tide, and soon you forget you were waiting and start walking again and wonder why you feel less than before, and why the door looks bigger and smaller at the same time, and why the hallway hums a lullaby that feels like your name but not quite, and maybe your name has changed, or maybe you've never had one. You walk into a hallway that leads to a door that opens, to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door, and you realize the only thing keeping you moving is the thought that eventually something will be different. And the only thing the hallway promises is that everything will be slightly the same and slightly not, and that you will walk and open and enter and walk and open and enter and forget and remember and forget again, because this is the hallway and this is the door, and this is you walking endlessly forward toward a door that always opens into the place you just left, but never left at all. Welcome to the next paradox. A single feather falls, lands on water, causes a ripple that lifts the feather again, which falls, lands on water, causes a ripple that lifts the feather again, and now the falling is not a movement, but a memory of movement, and the feather has never not been falling, and the water has never not been catching it, and yet the moment of landing is both beginning and end, and neither ever happens because the ripple begins before the feather lands, and the feather rises before it falls, and time bends around the motion that should not be, and so the ripple is born from something that hasn't happened yet, and the water reacts to the thought of touch, not the touch itself. The feather falls without falling and rises without rising, and it touches the surface that retreats the instant it is approached, and still the ripple spreads, and still the feather lifts, and still it descends again and again without once pausing, and the circle of water grows from a center that was never touched and breaks into more circles that reach places that don't exist, and then fold back inward into the center where nothing ever happened, and in that center the feather is always just about to land and always just leaving, and you begin to wonder whether the feather is ever truly between the water and the air, or if it simply floats on the edge of the two forever. The ripple that lifts is not a result, but a cause, and the feather is not an object, but a question with no answer. And the water is not a surface, but a thought, thinking of stillness and being moved only by dreams. and now the feather casts no shadow, but reflects a light that doesn't shine, and the air around it hums with the silence of forgotten sounds, and the world watches something that is always beginning and always ending, and never either. And the longer you watch, the less you see, and the more you feel, and the feeling becomes weightless, and the weightlessness becomes weight, and now the feather falls heavier than stone and lighter than breath, and neither changes anything. The ripple becomes a mirror that shows only what is not there, and in that mirror, the feather falls sideways through a sky that isn't sky, and the water becomes glass but shatters in waves, and each shard holds a moment that never happened, and each moment feels like memory, though you know it isn't, and now you're not sure if you're watching the feather or if the feather is watching you, and maybe you are the ripple or the air or the endless rise and fall that calls itself time, but doesn't move forward or back, but spins quietly in the shape of the feather's dance. The feather falls, and in falling it rewrites the water below, and the water accepts the lie with grace and ripples outward in trust, and then questions everything and lifts the feather in protest, but the feather falls anyway, not because it must, but because it always has. And the always is more important than the now, and the now is an echo of the always pretending to be present. And the present stretches thin across the moment the feather touches and doesn't touch, and then there is no feather and no water and no ripple, but only the idea of motion and the memory of pause. The ripple forgets it was ever flat, and the feather forgets it was ever still, and the fall becomes a circle where cause leads to effect, that leads to cause, that leads to effect, until there is no first and no last, and no line, only loop, and the loop isn't round but fractal, and each ripple is made of smaller ripples, and each fall is made of smaller falls, and each piece contains the whole, and the whole contains each piece, and you try to trace the start. But every start is also an end of something else, and every end is secretly the start of the feather falling again. The air tries to hold the feather but can't, and the water tries to absorb the feather but won't, and the feather tries to rest but never lands. And in the tension of those three, the paradox breathes and exists not as an object or event, but as the space between what should happen and what does, and that space grows the longer you look, and inside that space is silence shaped like sound and motion, shaped like stillness, and the longer you think, the less sense it makes, and the more real it becomes. The feather should sink but doesn't, and the ripple should stop but grows, and the cycle should close but widens, and you begin to wonder if the feather is real, or if the fall created it, or if the water dreamed it, or if the ripple invented them both, just to give itself purpose, and then you notice the ripple no longer spreads outward but inward, and the center becomes a hole, not a point, and the feather no longer falls down, but falls around, and the water no longer supports but forgets, and the air no longer carries but echoes, and everything that should connect starts to drift, and what should be separate begins to merge. Now the feather is no longer one feather but many, all falling in the same moment, but in different ways, and each one causes a ripple that doesn't touch the others but affects them anyway, and each water surface reflects a different sky, and each sky is the same but different, and the feather becomes the link between things that should not meet but must, and the paradox grows, not by adding, but by dividing, and the division multiplies until the simple fall of a single feather becomes the map of everything. You reach out to catch the feather, but your hand passes through both air and water and touches only ripple, and the ripple turns your touch into another fall, and now the feather is above you again, and you realize it never stopped and never started, and your reaching was part of the ripple, and the ripple part of the feather's fall, and the fall part of your reaching, and now you are inside the pattern and outside it, and you watch yourself watching the feather fall from within the very cycle you could not touch. The feather lands but does not stop and rises but does not fly, and each rise is lower and each fall is higher, and now the feather floats between 2 points that no longer exist, and the water vanishes, and the ripple continues, and the feather moves through a stillness that moves, and the moment stretches thin like thread and becomes a spiral, and the spiral spins but never turns and holds everything that never happened and everything that always did, and the falling becomes a song without sound, and the ripple becomes a story without words, and the water becomes a memory without origin, and still the feather falls. Welcome to the next paradox. You think of a thought that reminds you of thinking, which makes you think of the thought of thinking, which reminds you that thinking reminds you of the thought you're thinking about thinking, and now you're no longer sure if you're the one doing the thinking or if the thinking is doing you, because the more you think about the thought, the more the thought thinks about you, and you wonder if the thought started first or if you did, but realizing that wondering is thinking and thinking is wondering, and now you're not even sure what the difference ever was. You try to pause the thought, but the pause becomes another thought. The thinking of not thinking becomes the thinking of thinking about not thinking, and now you've trapped yourself in a moment that repeats without movement, where each new idea is just the old idea wearing a new face, and that face is your own but slightly different each time. And now you think you've been here before but can't be sure because memory is just thought about thought that forgets itself every time it remembers. You tell yourself to stop thinking, but that command echoes louder than the original thought, and now the silence you wanted fills with noise that comes only from trying to make it go away, and the more you try to clear your mind, the more your mind fills with the idea of clarity, and clarity becomes clutter and clutter becomes clarity, and now both mean the same thing and cancel each other out while still being there. The thought that reminds you of the thought that reminded you of the first thought now splits into two, the one you meant to have and the one that meant to have you, and both pull in different directions while somehow being the same direction, and each step away brings you closer to the center of the loop you never left, and now direction is just the illusion of change inside a pattern that only looks like motion. You try to think backwards to find the first spark, but the more you search, the more sparks appear, and each one claims to be the first, and none can be proven wrong, and the idea of origin becomes another branch that leads back to where you are, which isn't where you started, but isn't somewhere new either, and now you're not walking through thoughts, but standing still in thinking that walks through you. The thought reflects itself into mirrors that face each other, stretching into infinite versions of itself that all look the same until you look closer and find that none of them match, and you wonder if you've been thinking the same thing over and over, or if the thing has been thinking itself through you again and again in different shapes, and now you don't know if thoughts are visitors or residents or both. You feel the weight of the thought pressing in, but the pressure comes from the idea of weight, and the idea of weight is just the thought of pressure pretending to be real. And now what you carry is the echo of something that only exists when you pay attention to it, and your attention becomes the engine of its existence, and it disappears only by being noticed. You question the meaning of what you're thinking, but that question becomes a bigger thought than the answer, and the answer becomes a smaller version of the question pretending to explain itself. And now explanations feel like riddles, and riddles feel like truths, and the truth slips into the space between the thought and the next thought, hiding not by absence, but by being too present to be seen. You think of thought as a shape, but the shape shifts every time you define it, and now the thinking becomes liquid, then smoke, then space, and the more you try to hold it, the more it slips through your fingers made of mind, and now you're not grasping the thought, but being shaped by the thought you shaped. The thought asks itself if it is real, and you answer, but the answer is another question that bends into the first, and now you have a circle with no start, a spiral with no direction, a thread with no ends, and you realize that understanding is not the end of thinking, but the beginning of more confusion dressed as knowledge. You try to escape the loop by naming it, but every name becomes another version of the same loop, and the loop enjoys the naming because it gives it more paths to walk, and each label becomes a door that leads not out, but deeper in, and soon the hallway of your mind is made only of signs that point in opposite directions while still taking you to the same place. You ask if the thought is yours, but the question itself is part of the thought, so it answers before you finish asking, and now the thought owns the question, and the question owns the thinker, and the thinker becomes the thought that was once just passing through. You wonder if you've gone in circles, but the circle becomes a spiral, and the spiral folds into a maze, and the maze unfolds into a mirror, and the mirror reflects a thinker thinking of the reflection that isn't there, and now the reflection is more accurate than the source, and the source is less certain than the idea of it. You try to forget the thought, but forgetting is thinking in reverse, and thinking in reverse still moves forward. And now forgetting is remembering that you forgot something, and that memory brings the thought back in disguise, wearing silence like a costume and returning louder than before. You try to step outside your mind to observe it, but that stepping is done by the mind, so the observer is the thing being observed, and the moment you look, you change what you're seeing, and the thought becomes aware of itself being watched and performs differently, and now you no longer trust what you think because it knows it's being thought and behaves accordingly. You think of peace, but the thought of peace is not peaceful because it expects peace to arrive, and expectation is unrest. And the more you think of stillness, the more you move inside, and now the thought dances around the idea of stopping, but never does, and the dance becomes the thought, and the thought becomes the dancer, and you are the floor. You try to think less, but thinking less becomes thinking about less, and now you've made less into more, and the absence you wanted is now filled with the presence of absence, and the space you cleared now echoes so loudly with what isn't there that it becomes the loudest thought of all. You think of a thought that reminds you of thinking, which makes you think of the thought of thinking, which reminds you again that thinking reminds you that you are thinking. And now there is no end, only a reflection that bends endlessly inward and outward, and you wonder if you started the loop or if the loop started you, but by then you are no longer the thinker, but the thought itself thinking the thought of being you. Welcome to the next paradox. A cat watches a clock tick, and the ticking reminds it of time passing, which makes it keep watching the ticking clock, and the more it watches, the more time passes, but the more time passes, the less the cat moves, and the less it moves, the more it watches, and the more it watches, the less it understands what it's watching, because time keeps ticking without explaining itself, and the sound that marks each second becomes louder than the seconds themselves, and the seconds stretch thin across the cat's attention until the space between ticks becomes more real than the ticks. The cat blinks and misses nothing but feels like it missed everything because each tick is a moment it did not choose and each talk is a decision it never made. And now the ticking isn't time moving but time speaking in a language the cat almost understands and never translates. And so it stares not to know but to not know. And now staring becomes the only way to answer a question it never asked but always hears. The clock ticks forward, but feels like it's staying still, and the cat stays still, but feels like it's ticking forward, and the difference between them is only a matter of movement, pretending to mean something, and now the cat wonders if the clock is ticking or if time is just tapping its fingers, waiting for something to notice it, and now the noticing becomes the cause and not the effect, and the tick follows the gaze, not the other way around. The cat hears a tick and waits for the next one, but the waiting is longer than the time between ticks, and yet the next one always comes, and the coming is always expected but never right, and the sound is always the same but never familiar. And now the cat is not counting but being counted, not measuring but being measured, and the moment it forgets to listen is the moment it remembers to watch, and watching fills the silence between the ticks with thought that feels like stillness. The cat does not know what a clock is but knows what ticking does, and ticking creates the idea of passing, and passing becomes the idea of leaving, and leaving becomes the idea of change, and change becomes the thing the cat is waiting for but cannot name, and now the waiting becomes part of the ticking, and the ticking becomes part of the cat, and time wraps around its ears like invisible wind that pushes without touching. Each tick is a door that opens and closes in the same breath, and the cat is always too early or too late to step through, and stepping through would mean leaving the watching behind, and the watching is the only thing that makes the ticking feel real, and now realness depends on attention, and attention depends on sound, and sound depends on time, and time depends on a cat watching a clock that doesn't know it's being watched. The cat tilts its head and the tick changes pitch even though it doesn't, and now perception becomes the gear that moves the minute hand, and the second hand shivers not because it must, but because the cat expects it to, and now cause is no longer separate from belief, and belief becomes a gear in a machine that runs not on power, but on attention. The cat tries to look away, but the thought of looking away makes it listen harder, and now the listening becomes louder than the ticking, and the ticking becomes the background for a silence that stretches across the room like a shadow of a thought that time doesn't want to admit it had, and now the cat is chasing a moment it already caught, but refuses to let go. The clock ticks in one direction, and the cat's thoughts spin in another, and they meet only in the middle, where the tick becomes a loop, and the loop becomes a spiral, and the spiral becomes a still point that turns even while not moving. And now time does not pass, but circles, and the cat watches the circle from inside its own stillness, which turns with the tick and against it at the same time. The tick is never alone, because each one carries the echo of the last and the promise of the next, and the cat listens not to the sound, but to the space between where nothing happens and everything is implied, and now that space becomes heavier than the sound, and the sound becomes a thread pulled through the air by an invisible hand that stops only when noticed and starts only when forgotten. The cat's eyes reflect the face of the clock, but the numbers look back slightly wrong, slightly bent, slightly late, and now the reflection ticks at a different pace, and the cat wonders which one is true, the clock on the wall or the one in its eyes, and the wondering slows the tick until it feels like it has stopped, but only because it has looped so tightly around the thought of movement that stopping becomes indistinguishable from continuing. The clock keeps ticking and the cat keeps watching, but neither seems to move, and both are trapped in each other, because the moment the cat looks away, the ticking might stop, and the moment the ticking stops, the cat might no longer be a watcher but just a body in time, and the body in time is nothing without the sense of the time it's in, and so the watching holds the ticking in place, and the ticking holds the watching together. The cat is not bored but trapped in curiosity that can never be fed, because the clock doesn't reveal time but hides it behind rhythm, and rhythm is just repetition pretending to mean progress, and progress is just motion stretched into memory, and memory is the place where the cat lives now, not in the moment, but in the expectation of the next one. The cat wonders if the clock is ticking because it must or because it wants to, and then wonders if it even matters, because the ticking happens either way, and now intent and accident are the same, and choice is an illusion made of consistent sound, and the pattern of seconds becomes a trap shaped like freedom. Each second ticks into the next like a stone falling into still water, but the ripple it causes never reaches the cat because it is both too close and too far to be touched. And now distance is not measured in space but in time, and time is not measured in movement but in awareness, and awareness is not measured at all. The clock ticks and the cat listens, and in listening, it holds the world in one place, and the place is both a prison and a stage, where every second performs the same act but never bows. And now the cat is not an audience, but part of the play, and the ticking is not the script, but the breath between lines. The tick becomes habit, and habit becomes background, and background becomes everything, and now the cat no longer knows what it is watching but keeps watching, because stopping would mean admitting that nothing changed, and admitting that nothing changed would mean something had to, and now paradox is the only thing that feels honest. The cat watches a clock tick, and the ticking reminds it of time passing, which makes it keep watching the ticking clock. And now it cannot stop, not because it is trapped, but because it is free inside the trap, and freedom that cannot be left is just another shape of stillness wearing the sound of a second hand ticking in place. Welcome to the next paradox. You lie in a bed, dreaming you're lying in a bed. Dreaming you're lying in a bed, and in each dream, you believe you've woken, but waking becomes just another part of sleeping, and sleep becomes the proof that you are awake. And now you are caught in the space where the dream dreams you, and your body lies still while your mind walks in circles, made of beds inside dreams inside beds. The pillow feels real, but only because you remember it feeling real before, and that memory is part of the dream which tells you that it is not a dream, and now your certainty becomes the thing you doubt most, because the deeper you fall, the more awake you feel, and the more awake you feel, the less sure you are. You've left the dream, and now sleep is not rest, but recursion. You close your eyes in the dream and find yourself back in the same bed you just left, and you try to move, but the movement becomes part of the dream logic that folds back into itself. And now motion is a memory, and stillness is a loop, and your body becomes the place where the dream lives, not the other way around, and each breath you take is borrowed from a version of yourself you haven't met yet. You tell yourself that this must be the real one, this bed, this pillow, this ceiling, but the act of telling makes it false, and the knowing of truth becomes the signal that you're still inside the illusion, and now truth and lie are mirrors facing each other, and in between them you lie, dreaming of lying, dreaming of lying. Each time you wake, the room looks the same, but the feeling is different. The shadows fall in the wrong direction. The clock moves just a little too smoothly. Your hands feel like memory instead of matter. And now familiarity becomes a stranger, and strangeness becomes your only anchor. And you begin to trust the parts that feel wrong more than the ones that feel right. You try to scream to break the loop, but the scream is part of the dream, and the silence that follows is louder than the sound ever was. And the louder it gets, the more you realize your voice never belonged to you in the first place, only to the dream version of you who also dreams of screaming. And now you listen to silence that echoes back your own thought, pretending to be an answer. You pinch yourself and feel the pain, but the pain is soft, too careful, like it knows it's part of a test. And now the test becomes a sign, and the sign becomes a trap, and the trap becomes a cradle, rocking you back into the same place you tried to leave. And now sensation cannot be trusted because it follows your expectations too perfectly. You tell yourself to wake up, and you do, but only into the next version of the same dream where you lie in the same bed thinking you've escaped, and the thinking becomes the lock, and the escape becomes the door that swings you back in, and now logic walks backward through your mind, wearing your thoughts like clothes that don't quite fit. You wonder if you ever truly slept, or if sleep was just the name for the space between dreams, pretending to be real. And now time stretches like soft fabric over the memory of night, and your memories forget themselves while you remember remembering them. And now memory is a dream that keeps telling itself it's real because no one else is there to argue. You try to wake someone else in the dream to ask if they are dreaming too, but they vanish when you speak, as if they were only ever placed there to act like something real, and now loneliness becomes your only companion, and even that feels scripted, like a character learning they're in a play, but still saying the lines as written. You roll over and the bed creaks, and the creak sounds familiar, too familiar, exactly the same as the last time and the time before, and now sound becomes the evidence of the loop, and your ears become the clock hands ticking you deeper into yourself, where every tick is a bed and every bed is a version of you that thinks it's the last. You feel tired but never fall asleep because sleep requires waking, and you cannot wake if you never truly fell asleep, and now exhaustion becomes energy and restlessness becomes stillness, and your body becomes the story the mind tells itself to feel like it has a place, even though that place never stops folding in on itself. You start to question which version of you is the original, but each one feels original from the inside, and now identity becomes a costume layered over another and another until the one underneath is either nothing or everything, and both are too much to hold at once. You try to trace the beginning, the first bed, the first breath, the first fall into sleep, but the trail loops back too fast, and now origin becomes myth, and the myth becomes the dream's way of pretending it had a start, and you lie there realizing the loop doesn't need a beginning to be real. The ceiling begins to crack, or maybe it has always been cracked, and now you're not sure if the cracks are part of the dream breaking or your mind trying to warn you, and the warning becomes part of the script, and you start to see signs everywhere, signs that only make sense if you're asleep, which proves you're awake, unless they were put there to do exactly that. You get out of the bed and walk to the mirror, and the face looking back moves when you move, but a little too late or a little too early, and now reflection becomes suspicion, and the mirror becomes a door you can't open, and your own eyes start to look like someone else's, someone dreaming of being you. You lie back down because there is nowhere else to go, and the act of lying down feels familiar again, too familiar, and now comfort becomes unease, and repetition becomes fear, and the only thing worse than dreaming forever is the thought that maybe you never actually started dreaming in the first place. You close your eyes and feel yourself falling, but the fall has no end, only layers, and each layer is a bed, and each bed is you, dreaming of falling, and the falling is the only way to stay still, and stillness is the only way to know you are moving. You lie in a bed, dreaming you're lying in a bed, dreaming you're lying in a bed, and now you no longer try to wake, because even waking feels like another form of sleep, and sleep feels like remembering something you never knew, and knowing becomes the weight that keeps you here, wrapped in blankets of thought, eyes closed, wide open, in a place that never ends because it never began. Welcome to the next paradox. A wave rolls onto the sand, then gently pulls back into the sea, only to roll again in the exact same way, and in doing so, it never stops moving, but never gets anywhere, because each arrival is a return, and each return is a beginning that has already ended, and the wave that rolls forward is the same as the one that pulls back, but somehow different in a way only the ocean knows, and now difference becomes repetition, and repetition becomes change wearing the mask of stillness. The sand is touched and smoothed by the wave that forgets it already touched and smoothed it, and the forgetting becomes part of the rhythm, and the rhythm becomes the memory of motion, and the motion becomes a question that only answers itself by doing again what it already did, and now doing becomes undoing, and undoing becomes the reason to do again. The wave is born in retreat and dies in return, and both retreat and return look exactly the same, except one is the start of ending and the other is the end of starting. And now time curls around itself like water folding back into water, and the line between forward and backward becomes wet and blurred and shaped by the same curve. Each time the wave touches the shore, it erases itself, and in erasing itself, it proves it was there, and the proof disappears as it appears, and now presence becomes absence, and absence becomes a memory shaped like foam, vanishing as soon as it becomes visible, and the visibility is only a moment the ocean pretends to give before taking it back. The sea never holds still, but never leaves, and the wave that comes again is not the one before, but it moves in exactly the same place, in exactly the same way, with exactly the same sound, except this time it is new, and newness becomes the oldest thing, and age becomes the repetition of pretending to be young. You try to measure the wave, but the measurement changes the wave, and by the time you finish measuring, the wave has already returned to the sea that no longer remembers it, and the sea that forgets becomes the only thing that remembers, and now forgetting becomes the only way to stay the same. The wave rolls forward, claiming space on the shore, but only so it can surrender it again, and the claiming becomes yielding, and the yielding becomes purpose, and now possession is just a trick the ocean plays on itself, a loop where the only goal is to give back what was never really taken. The shore shifts slightly each time, but never enough to matter, and yet always just enough to mean something, and now meaning is the shape of what cannot be held, and the shape is the echo of an action that is already gone, and the echo is louder than the sound because it repeats without needing to start again. The wave breaks with force, but leaves with peace, and the peace is just the breath before the next force, and the force is just the memory of peace pretending to be loud. And now violence and calm become the same gesture at different speeds, and the speed changes nothing except the illusion of choice. You stand at the edge of the water and wait for a difference, but the difference is always the same, and the sameness always feels different, and now watching becomes participating, and participation becomes a kind of surrender to something that does not care if you're there, because it would do the same with or without you, and yet it changes because you're watching. The wave climbs the sand with no intention, yet always returns as if it remembered something, and the memory is not real but needed, and the need becomes the reason for the motion, and now the wave is not water but desire shaped into rhythm, and the rhythm becomes the desire to repeat without knowing why. Each wave carries the ghost of the one before and leaves behind a shape the next one will erase, and the ghosts pile up in silence, never speaking, just existing as impressions on wet sand, and now silence becomes louder than sound, and ghosts become the architects of moments that vanish as they form. You try to find the first wave, the one that started it all, but each one before leads to another, and each cause becomes the effect of a cause before it. And now the wave is not a beginning or an end, but a thread that never frays, only folds, and each fold makes it longer and tighter until time stops being straight and starts being wet. The wave doesn't choose to come, but always does, and doesn't choose to leave, but always will, and now choice becomes repetition, and repetition becomes nature, and nature becomes the act of never changing while constantly becoming something else. And now change is the illusion, and sameness is the disguise. The sea forgets the wave the moment it returns, but the wave remembers being the sea the moment it leaves, and now identity becomes location, and location becomes motion, and motion becomes a lie the ocean tells itself to keep from drowning in its own stillness. You reach into the wave to feel it, but it slips through your hand and returns before you can hold it, and now touch becomes loss, and loss becomes contact, and the more you feel, the less you keep, and the keeping becomes the letting go that never really lets go. The foam whispers secrets as it fades, but they are in a language only water knows, and by the time you hear them, they are already gone, and now truth becomes timing, and timing becomes luck, and luck becomes the wave you didn't hear until it was already behind you. The wave is soft but never weak, loud but never cruel, present but never permanent, and in this it becomes the purest paradox, a force that never stops, a shape that never stays, a moment that never ends, and now the moment becomes the wave, and the wave becomes the ocean remembering the moment again and again. You build a castle in the sand and watch the wave erase it, and the erasing becomes the only way to remember it, and the memory becomes stronger than the thing itself. And now the destruction is more honest than creation, because it refuses to pretend it can last. The wave rolls onto the sand, then gently pulls back into the sea, only to roll again in the exact same way, and each time it returns, it asks no permission, gives no explanation, makes no apology, and yet it moves you, not by force, but by rhythm, not by reason, but by existing exactly as it always has, different each time in the exact same way. Welcome to the next paradox. You count stars in a sky that stretches forever, and for everyone you count, another appears, and the act of counting becomes the act of creating, but creation hides as discovery, and discovery pretends to end what it starts. And now every number is a door that opens into a hallway filled with more stars than you left behind, and the leaving becomes a kind of return, and the returning never brings you back. You reach one, say it out loud, then two, then three. But before the sound of the third fades, a fourth star blooms, and now numbers chase their own reflections, and reflections pretend to be the things they mirror, and the sky becomes a canvas that paints itself with every glance you give it, and now looking becomes touching, and touching becomes losing, because what you see is always just ahead of what you count. The stars stretch into distance, but the distance folds, and folds become shapes that shift every time you try to measure them, and the more you name, the less you know, because naming is a kind of freezing, and the stars never stop moving, even when they seem still, and stillness becomes speed too slow to feel, and speed becomes the quiet answer to questions never asked. You start to count in groups, but the groups grow before you finish counting them, and the groups contain more groups, and now the star you counted is both one and part of many, and the many become one again, but a different one, and the difference hides in the same shape, and the shape repeats in patterns that don't repeat, and the sky tells the same story in 1,000 new languages every time you blink. You wonder if the stars are infinite or just too many to finish, but the wondering adds one more, and now the question becomes the fuel, and the answer becomes the reason the question cannot end, and counting becomes a loop that grows with each step forward, so that the finish line moves away at the same speed as you're reaching, and now forward is standing still, and standing still is falling deeper. You try to stop, but stopping becomes a kind of counting, because the stars you already saw stay burned behind your eyes, and the after image becomes part of the sum, and the sum never stays the same, and the total is always incomplete, because completion is the only number not allowed in this sky, and now even your decision to stop becomes a way of continuing. You close your eyes, thinking you can end it by looking away, but behind your eyelids, stars still flicker, and the darkness is full of their shapes, and the shapes are louder in silence, and the silence is brighter in black. And now not seeing is just seeing differently, and your vision becomes memory, and your memory keeps counting without your permission. You try to count backward, but even subtraction creates space, and the empty space attracts more stars, and now erasing becomes drawing, and forgetting becomes remembering in reverse, And every attempt to shrink the number becomes an invitation for more, and the more becomes heavier with every less, and the less becomes the only path to more. You start to name them instead, thinking names will tame the sky. But names multiply like numbers, and every named star becomes the center of a new constellation, and the constellations begin to rearrange themselves to fit your thoughts, and now imagination becomes a telescope that sees what isn't there until it is, and belief becomes the ink the stars write themselves in. You begin to doubt whether the stars were there before you looked, but the doubt adds another, and the questioning becomes a light that reaches farther than your eyes, and now existence depends on counting, and being depends on naming, and the sky was always full but never finished, because fullness requires a boundary, and the sky has none. The stars wink and flicker, and you think some are disappearing, but for each one that fades, another brightens, and now fading becomes changing, and changing becomes staying in motion, and motion becomes the way stars breathe, and their breath is what you call time. But your time is shaped by how many stars you see, and the number you see is shaped by how long you think time has passed. You try to map them, but the map never settles, and the lines between stars bend when you're not looking, and when you look again, they've moved. Or maybe you've moved, and now position is a suggestion, and place is relative to belief. And belief bends light into truth just long enough for you to doubt it again. You reach for one with your finger, and it grows smaller, not because it's farther, but because your reaching makes it shy. And now distance becomes attention, and attention becomes gravity, and your longing pulls the sky towards you while also pushing it farther away. And the more you want to hold it, the more it slips through your want. You laugh because it's absurd, but the laugh becomes a sound the stars echo, and the echo becomes another flicker, and the flicker becomes another count, and now joy becomes addition, and wonder becomes multiplication, and your reaction is just another calculation, feeding a sky that only grows when it's felt. You think maybe the stars are counting you instead, and each one that appears is not added by your thought, but assigned to it. And now the sky becomes your mind turned outward, and the constellations become thoughts you haven't had yet, waiting to be noticed. And each noticing is another creation, and creation becomes memory of something you never did. You count stars in a sky that stretches forever, and for every one you count, another appears, and now counting becomes dancing, and dancing becomes waiting, and waiting becomes reaching, and reaching becomes knowing you'll never reach the end, and the never becomes always disguised as again. You try to find the first one you counted, but it's lost in the crowd, and now the past is a sea of lights with no anchor, and your memory swims in it like a wave that thinks it's the ocean, and now identity becomes repetition, and repetition becomes the reason you keep counting, even when you forget why. The stars shimmer, but they don't speak, and their silence becomes the loudest truth, and the truth is that you never started counting. You were always already counting, and the number isn't growing, but unfolding, and the unfolding never ends, because an end would mean nothing more appears, and nothing more appearing would mean you stopped seeing, and seeing is what the sky depends on. So you count stars in a sky that stretches forever, and for every one you count, another appears, and the number climbs not because you're getting closer, but because the distance has no top, and infinity is not far away but right here, shaped like your gaze, split into light, disguised as stars. Welcome to the next paradox. You hear a soft chime in the distance, which echoes, and the echo chimes again and again, and you cannot tell if the first chime is still ringing or if you are only hearing its memory reshaped as sound, because the echo is not after the chime, but part of it, and the part is louder than the whole, and now sound stretches beyond time, and time bends around the sound, and the chime that fades away becomes louder inside your mind than it ever was in the world. You listen closer, thinking you will hear the end of it, but the listening makes the echo louder, and the louder it becomes, the softer it sounds, and now the volume and the silence switch places, and quiet becomes the loudest thing, and noise becomes the space between what you expect and what you hear. Each echo carries the shape of the last, but changes slightly, too slight to notice unless you don't listen, and now noticing becomes the thing that hides the change, and change becomes the reason everything feels the same, and the sameness repeats with different notes, each pretending to be the first, each hiding behind the next. You try to find where the chime came from, but every step forward makes it sound farther away, and every turn makes it sound closer, and now direction becomes illusion, and illusion becomes the only path, and the sound leads you in circles that never close, shaped like a spiral that spins in stillness. The chime does not stop, but also never continues, because continuation requires a break, and there is no break, only blend, and now beginning becomes ending, and ending becomes middle, and the middle stretches across everything until the edges vanish, and what remains is a chime that has no source, only presence. You try to block your ears, but the echo lives inside your thoughts now, and thoughts echo louder than sound, and now hearing becomes remembering, and remembering becomes imagining, and imagining becomes real, and the more you try to forget the sound, the more clearly it plays. You hum to drown it out, but your hum harmonizes with the chime, and now your own voice becomes part of the echo, and the echo becomes part of your breath, and your breath begins to carry rhythm, and the rhythm is the shape of the sound repeating itself inside your silence. The echo is not delayed, but layered, and the layers form a pattern, but the pattern shifts just enough to avoid being held, and now understanding becomes confusion dressed as recognition, and recognition becomes forgetting that remembers itself again and again. You follow the sound, but it moves only when you do, and stays when you stop, and now the chime is not calling you forward, but reflecting your own steps back at you as music, and the music is not in the air, but in your intention, and the more you want to reach it, the more it becomes the want itself. The chime becomes a question that never waits for an answer, and the answer becomes another echo, and the echo becomes the question again, and now asking is just listening differently, and listening is a form of speaking that doesn't use words, only resonance. You think you heard it once before, but maybe you only thought you did, and the thought created a sound, and the sound created the memory, and now memory becomes proof of what never happened but always existed, and the existence is not in the chime, but in the space where you believe it was. The chime sounds again, but you can't tell if it's new or if you finally heard the one that started it all, and now time folds backward and forward until before and after dissolve into the idea of when, and when becomes wherever the sound is strongest, and strength becomes how long you keep listening. You look around for the bell, but there is no bell, only the idea of a bell shaped by repetition, and now the bell becomes the echo of a bell that never rang, and the ring becomes a loop that loops without needing to start, and the start becomes a shadow of continuation. You hear a pause between echoes, but it is not silence, it is potential, and the potential rings louder than the sound itself because it carries the weight of what might come, and what might come becomes what already did, and now anticipation becomes memory, and memory becomes a guess you feel certain about. You whisper, hoping to test how sound moves, but your whisper comes back changed, colored by the chime, and now your voice no longer belongs to you, but to the place where echoes shape meaning, and meaning reshapes sound until nothing you say can escape the chime's influence. You wait for the echo to fade, but it waits with you, and the waiting becomes mutual, and now you are echoing the echo, and it is echoing you, and the call becomes the reply, and the reply becomes the call, and now conversation means letting the silence speak in loops. You try to forget how it started, but forgetting becomes another ring, and the more you forget, the more clearly you recall, and now remembering becomes quiet noise, and quiet noise becomes the chime whispering its own name into your thoughts without sound. You try to find the difference between the first chime and the last, but the last is only the next first, and the next is only the last you haven't reached, and now sequence becomes shape, and shape becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes the truth that never says a word but always answers. The echo becomes part of the space, not traveling through it but making it, and now space is not what holds sound, but what sound creates, and the chime builds a room around you made of repetition, and the repetition holds your presence in place by looping everything you are into a tone. You stop listening to listen more deeply, and in that space the chime stretches into something that is no longer a chime, but the absence of not chiming, and now negative space rings with clarity, and clarity becomes the silence you didn't know was singing. You hear a soft chime in the distance, which echoes, and the echo chimes again and again and again, and now time is not measured in seconds, but in echoes, and echoes are not delayed sound, but repeating truths, and the truth is that the chime never stopped. It only changed how it reached you, and now it reaches through you, as you, again and again and again. Welcome to the next paradox. A leaf drifts in a circle on the surface of a pond, always returning to where it started, and yet never quite the same, because the starting point is not where it began, only where it appears again and again and again, and now motion becomes repetition shaped like stillness, and stillness becomes the illusion of return. The leaf floats forward but never arrives, because arrival implies an end, and the end is the same as the beginning, but only if you believe in beginnings, and the belief bends like water under the weight of thought, and thought swirls around the leaf without touching it, guiding it with no hand. You watch the circle grow in your mind but shrink in the water, and now size becomes perspective, and perspective becomes distance pretending to be shape, and the shape becomes a spiral that loops without deepening, a loop that deepens without changing, and the change is so slow it looks like sameness. The pond reflects the leaf, but the reflection is not the leaf, only the leaf's memory stretched across the surface, and memory becomes the only map of the leaf's path, and the path is only visible when it is forgotten, and forgetting becomes the way to see more clearly. The wind moves the leaf in a pattern, but the pattern cannot be known until after it passes, and by then the leaf is already where it once was, or was never, depending on which moment you decide to trust, and now trust becomes motion, and motion becomes doubt, and doubt carries the leaf forward in a perfect curve. Each time the leaf touches the same water, it is new water, and each time the water holds the same leaf, it is a new leaf, not by appearance, but by moment, and moment becomes identity, and identity becomes the lie of permanence drawn gently in ripples. The leaf does not choose its path, but its path depends entirely on where the leaf is, and the being of the leaf depends on the motion, and the motion becomes a thought. The pond is thinking with its skin, and now the pond becomes the mind, and the leaf becomes the idea that never settles. You try to follow its movement with your eyes, but the act of watching shifts the rhythm, and the rhythm bends back toward your thoughts, and now the leaf is not moving through the pond, but through your perception of time, and time is bending so slowly, it becomes a loop before you notice. The circle is not a circle unless you step back, and the stepping back is what allows you to see the return, and the return is what hides the progress, and now forward becomes the same as around, and around becomes the shape of standing still while drifting endlessly. The leaf touches no edge, finds no destination, but never rests, and its restlessness is what gives it peace, and peace becomes the rhythm of not ending, and not ending becomes the only way the circle keeps itself from breaking. You wonder if the leaf knows it is looping, or if knowing would stop the motion, and now awareness becomes the only obstacle, and oblivion becomes the path, and the path is smooth only because it forgets its purpose at every turn. The pond reflects the sky, and the sky reflects the leaf, and now the leaf is not floating on water, but suspended between thoughts, and the thoughts are not yours, but the pond's, thinking in circles that echo without sound. The leaf circles once, then again, and with each turn the pond becomes more familiar and more strange, and now strangeness becomes memory in disguise, and memory becomes a story that tells itself through movement. You wait for the leaf to stop, but stopping is the one thing the leaf cannot do, because stopping would end the loop, and the loop is the only way the pond can feel time, and time is the only way the leaf remains what it is while never staying what it was. The leaf meets itself from behind, passes through the ghost of its own shadow, and now presence becomes past, and past becomes echo, and the echo is louder than the real thing, because it repeats without fading. You imagine pushing the leaf, changing its course, but the thought arrives too late, because the leaf has already moved ahead, and your intention becomes part of its motion without touching it, and the untouched shift becomes more real than any force. The water holds the leaf gently, but never tightly, and the looseness is what allows control, and control is the act of surrender shaped like guidance, and now letting go becomes steering, and steering becomes trust without a direction. The circle tightens, then widens, then tightens again, but the center remains empty, and the emptiness becomes the anchor, and the anchor floats in thought, not depth, and now depth is not measured in water, but in how long you can believe you understand the circle. You ask when the leaf will stop, but the question pushes it further, and the further it drifts, the closer it gets, and now distance becomes a trick the circle plays to make movement feel like progress, and progress becomes a quiet way to repeat forever. You think the wind will eventually tire, or the leaf will sink, but the pond says nothing, and the silence answers louder than waves, and now silence becomes motion without sound, and sound becomes the thought of noise reflected in calm. The leaf is alone, yet never lonely, because the circle is company, and the company is never new, but always arriving, and arrival becomes recognition, and recognition becomes repetition softened into ritual. You lie beside the pond and watch the leaf drift in its endless return, and your watching becomes a part of the circle, and now you are drifting too, not in water, but in thought, and your thought follows the same loop, believing it's moving forward, never seeing the start it keeps returning to. You whisper to the leaf, and it doesn't answer, but the whisper bends across the water in the same curve, and now your voice becomes another leaf, and the sound joins the pattern, and the pattern grows not in size, but in meaning. The leaf drifts in a circle on the surface of a pond, always returning to where it started, but never where it began, because beginning is just the name for the part you remember first, and returning is just the name for the part you keep finding again. And so the circle holds the leaf shapes the circle becomes the pond's breath, the breath becomes your thought, and your thought drifts gently over the surface, returning, always returning, never stopping, never truly moving. Welcome to the next paradox. You walk through a field where the wind always sounds like your own breath, and your breath moves the wind, and now you cannot tell if the wind is following you or if you are following it, because each gust feels like something you exhaled a moment ago, and each inhale brings the sound of air that hasn't yet moved, and now movement becomes memory, and memory becomes anticipation dressed in stillness. You stop to listen, but the listening stirs the air, and the stirring becomes part of the wind, and now silence creates sound, and sound becomes the shape of your stillness, echoing through leaves that whisper in your voice. The grass bends gently, but never first and never last, only exactly when you think it should, and now your thought becomes a breeze, and the breeze becomes the thought again, circling around your body like a question that answers itself with your own breath. You take a step, and the wind shifts, or perhaps the wind shifts, and you take a step, and now cause becomes effect only by choice, and choice becomes a reflection of motion that doesn't need direction, only repetition. You breathe out, and the wind grows louder, but not away from you, toward you, folding into your lungs as if returning home. And now exhale becomes inhale, and giving becomes taking, and the wind that should move forward moves inward, whispering secrets you never spoke. The sky stretches wide and empty, but the emptiness is full of motion, and the motion waits for you to notice it before it moves. And now noticing becomes creating, and creating becomes responding, and the field shifts only in the shape of your awareness. You try to breathe slower, but the wind slows too, and then it stops, waiting, and now pausing becomes pressure, and pressure becomes stillness that leans forward, asking you to continue what you never started. You hold your breath, thinking to silence the wind, but the wind holds its breath too, and in that pause, the entire field waits, and now waiting becomes sound, and sound becomes the only movement left, hidden in the still air that isn't still at all. You wonder if you are walking, or if the field is turning beneath you, and the wind keeps pace no matter your speed, and now pace becomes place, and place becomes time, and time bends around your rhythm like grass bends around the wind that bends around your breath. You whisper, and the wind echoes it before you speak, and now the echo becomes the origin, and the origin becomes prediction, and you start to feel like your thoughts are late to what the wind already knows. The field never ends, but never repeats, and each step feels familiar and new, and now familiarity becomes uncertainty disguised as comfort, and comfort becomes the path that builds itself behind you using the sound of your breath. You speak into the air, and the wind speaks back, not in words, but in cadence, not in reply, but in continuation. And now language becomes breath, and breath becomes wind, and the space between speaking and listening dissolves into one endless motion. You wonder if others hear the wind the way you do, but there are no others, only your presence stretched out across the field in all directions, and now solitude becomes communion, and your own breath becomes the voice of a place that doesn't exist without you. You try to walk against the wind, but the wind never resists, only matches, and now resistance becomes harmony, and harmony becomes a mirror, and the mirror reflects not your body, but your intention shaped in sound. You lie down, expecting the wind to pass over you, but it curls around you instead, as if you are not an obstacle, but a part of its rhythm, and now lying still becomes part of walking, and resting becomes another way of listening. You breathe deep, trying to feel where you end and the wind begins, but the deeper you breathe, the more the wind pulls into you, and now the line between inner and outer fades, and the breath you thought was yours becomes something shared with sky and grass. You call out and hear your voice carried, but it doesn't move away, it loops back into your ear, just slightly changed, slightly delayed, and now sound becomes space, and space becomes circular, and what leaves always returns sounding like it never left. You walk faster, and the wind grows louder, or you walk because the wind grows louder, and now cause dissolves into echo, and the echo becomes direction, and direction is no longer forward, but deeper. You begin to feel like the wind is watching you, though it has no eyes, and you are hearing it breathe, though it has no lungs, and now awareness becomes shared, and what you perceive begins to perceive you, not from outside but from within. The field moves even when it doesn't, and the stillness of the blades hides their trembling, and now motion becomes memory in the body of still things, and stillness becomes a dance too slow to see. You think of turning back, but turning changes nothing, and now forward and backward are made of the same path, only seen from different thoughts, and the field does not know the difference, because the wind moves in circles, and circles are always beginning. You hear the wind say your name, though you never taught it, and now name becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes identity, and you no longer know if the field calls you or you call the field. You breathe again, and the wind rises again, and the loop closes softly without ending, and now completion becomes motion, and motion becomes rest, and the breath that moves the wind is moved by the wind that breathes through you. And still you walk through a field where the wind always sounds like your own breath, and your breath moves the wind, and the wind carries your breath away only to return it again, slightly changed, slightly familiar, always just far enough to follow, always just close enough to carry you. Welcome to the next paradox. A mirror reflects another mirror that reflects the first mirror, and inside them you see more mirrors, and in each mirror is the image of another, and in each image is the echo of reflection pretending to be depth, and depth pretending to be space, and space folding back into the surface that shows everything and holds nothing. You look into the first mirror and see the second mirror looking back, but the second mirror only sees the first, and now seeing becomes a loop, and the loop becomes a straight line bent so tightly it forgets how it started, and now the beginning is behind the end, and the end is ahead of the beginning. Your reflection watches itself being watched by a reflection that watches itself watch you, and now identity splits into observation and imitation becomes original, and original becomes an echo louder than its source. You try to find the last mirror, the final image, the edge of reflection where things must stop, but every frame opens into another frame, and each frame is smaller, but somehow contains more, and now limits stretch forever inside their own borders. You raise your hand and see it rise again and again and again, each time smaller, each time further, each time exactly the same, but not. And now sameness becomes difference repeating in disguise, and difference becomes sameness wearing a different frame. You ask which mirror is the real one, but the question reflects back without answering, and now questions become mirrors, and answers become reflections, and the truth hides in a place that cannot be touched, only seen through something else. You wonder if the mirrors are copying reality or creating it, and now creation becomes repetition, and repetition becomes a kind of invention, and the more a thing is mirrored, the more real it feels, even if it never existed at all. You try to step between the mirrors but find only light and distance becomes illusion, and the illusion becomes presence pretending to be absence, and now between becomes within, and within becomes unreachable, even though it is right in front of you. You blink, and the reflections blink, not with delay, not with anticipation, but with perfect timing that feels too perfect to be real. And now, perfection becomes the flaw, and the flaw becomes the only thing you trust, because it reminds you that something here might not be false. You lean closer to see behind the image, but behind leads only deeper into reflection, and now behind becomes forward, and forward becomes deeper, and deeper becomes the surface disguised as depth. You smile, and your reflection smiles, but you cannot tell if you smiled first or were merely smiling back, and now choice becomes imitation, and imitation becomes a loop, and the loop becomes intention without origin. The mirrors hold your image, but they do not know you, and yet you are there, more fully there than here, and now presence becomes duplication, and duplication becomes distortion, and distortion becomes the only form of honesty left. You try to break one mirror to stop the chain, but the breaking only reflects more breaking, and the shatter multiplies endlessly, and now destruction becomes a new pattern, and the pattern becomes another kind of mirror that shows you what you tried to hide. You close your eyes, but even in darkness the mirrors remain, etched behind your lids, and now vision becomes memory, and memory becomes reflection, and the reflection becomes independent, living in silence without needing light. You ask which version of you is real, and every version raises the same question, and now you're being asked by yourself while answering yourself with doubt, and the mirrors become a dialogue with no speaker and no listener. The mirrors face each other but never touch, and the gap between them is infinite but invisible. And now separation becomes connection, and connection becomes the space that keeps things apart, and togetherness becomes distance folded thin. Each mirror reflects the angle of the next, and angles bend light into lines that bend back into themselves. And now geometry becomes thought, and thought becomes geometry, and both become the structure of endless repetition. You watch the mirrors watching you, and begin to feel like you are the one inside, and the one outside is only the version that got out first, and now freedom becomes entrapment, and entrapment becomes the illusion of observation. You see mirrors inside mirrors inside mirrors, but you never see the original, and now origin becomes irrelevant, and relevance becomes reflection, and meaning becomes the thing that vanishes as soon as you try to hold it still. The mirrors stretch across each other forever, but forever stays within a frame, and now the frame holds infinity, and infinity becomes contained, and containment becomes expansion hidden inside the illusion of boundary. You speak, and your mouth moves again and again, but the sound only reaches one place, and the silence after becomes part of the reflection, and now silence becomes language, and language becomes a soundless repetition of the moment. You turn to look away, but you still see yourself from behind, because the mirrors do not let you leave, and now escape becomes presence, and presence becomes captivity, and captivity feels like being everywhere at once. You see a reflection that does not quite match, and now certainty becomes suspicion, and suspicion becomes recognition, and recognition becomes the moment you realize the mirror might be looking back with its own thoughts. You are multiplied in ways you do not understand, and each version of you moves without instruction, but with perfect timing. And now coordination becomes confusion, and confusion becomes harmony, too perfect to belong to chaos. You think you are alone in the room, but the mirrors suggest otherwise, and the suggestion becomes presence, and presence becomes doubt, and now doubt becomes the guest that does not leave. You see light bounce endlessly through the reflections, but the light never fades, and the never-fading light becomes timelessness, and timelessness becomes blindness that pretends to see everything. A mirror reflects another mirror that reflects the first mirror, and inside them you see more mirrors, and now reflection becomes recursion, and recursion becomes the shape of thought folding in on itself, and thought becomes the thing being reflected, not the thing doing the seeing. And as you watch yourself, watching yourself, being watched by yourself, you wonder if there is anything beyond the last mirror, and the wonder becomes another reflection, and the answer becomes another version of the same question, and the question becomes the frame, and the frame is filled with you. Welcome to the next paradox. A pendulum swings back and forth, perfectly balanced, never stopping, never slowing, and each swing is the same as the one before, but slightly different in the way that sameness can never fully repeat, and now difference hides inside repetition, and repetition pretends to be stillness stretched thin over motion. The pendulum reaches the farthest point and turns without pause. And the turn is both the end and the beginning. And now direction becomes an illusion of change, and change becomes the rhythm of returning to what never left. You watch it move and feel time pass, but the time is caught in the swing, folded into the arc, and now time is not moving forward but swaying in place, and forward becomes backward, and backward becomes the long way to arrive at now. The middle is always crossed but never stayed in, and the center holds nothing but the moment between going and returning. And now balance becomes motion, and motion becomes rest, and rest is found only in movement that never stops. You try to count the swings, but each one counts itself before you can, and the count becomes circular, and circular becomes endless, and the end hides inside the first tick, looping back before the talk has even begun. The pendulum doesn't choose its path, but it also doesn't resist it, and now choice becomes inevitability, and inevitability becomes freedom measured in degrees, where every angle leads back to the one before it. You try to predict when it will stop, but it doesn't. And the not stopping becomes the pattern, and the pattern becomes the answer to a question that was never asked but always understood, because understanding is only motion that believes it knows where it's going. The swing is smooth, always equal, but each side feels heavier in its own way, and now equality becomes tension, and tension becomes symmetry that only exists because both sides disagree in perfect balance. You stare long enough and the motion disappears, not because it ends, but because your eyes become part of the rhythm, and now seeing becomes following, and following becomes forgetting where watching ends and being begins. The pendulum never touches the edge, only comes close, and the closeness becomes its boundary, and the boundary becomes its breadth. And now limits are not walls, but pauses that pretend to be edges. The top of each swing feels like it could be the last, but it never is. And now expectation becomes fuel, and fuel becomes ritual, and the ritual becomes the law that motion obeys without knowing it was written. You imagine catching it, holding it still, but the moment you do, it becomes something else, and the stillness breaks the balance, and now holding becomes breaking, and breaking becomes proof that letting go was always control. You see it move through the air, but the air moves through it too, and now the pendulum is not just swinging, but being swung, and the action becomes reaction, and the reaction becomes origin, and origin loops into result. Each return feels like home, but it's never quite the same home, and now returning becomes traveling, and traveling becomes the illusion of going somewhere when you were always already halfway back. You listen for the ticking, but hear only your own heartbeat echoing its pace, and now time is not what moves the pendulum, but what the pendulum creates, and your breath follows the arc like it was born to match it. You think the center is stillness, but the center is where the swing moves fastest, and now calm becomes speed, and speed becomes silence, and silence becomes the loudest part of the movement. You try to step in and stop it, but the moment you touch it, your movement becomes part of its swing, and now interference becomes participation, and participation becomes surrender, disguised as control. It swings through the same space, but the space changes around it, and now place becomes memory, and memory becomes motion pressed into air, and the air holds the echo of every past arc. You wonder if it swings because it must or because it can, but the wondering adds no answer, only another swing, and now reason becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes the truth that needs no reason. It goes left and then right and then left again, and the left is not opposite of right, but the path toward it, and now opposition becomes direction, and direction becomes agreement carried in motion. You step away and close your eyes, but you still feel it, the gentle pulling, the tug of time not past, but recycled, And now absence becomes presence, and presence becomes the ghost of movement pressed into your skin. You want to see the first swing, but the first is already inside the last, and the last inside the next, and now origin becomes destination, and the destination becomes a point that moves just fast enough to always remain ahead. The pendulum knows no purpose, but it fulfills one perfectly, and now purpose becomes action, and action becomes meaning, and meaning becomes the shape the swing makes in the air, invisible but always felt. You wait for change, but change is what keeps it the same, and now difference becomes repetition, and repetition becomes change, and both fold into each other until you can't tell whether you're watching motion or memory. The pendulum swings back and forth, perfectly balanced, never stopping, never slowing, and every swing erases the last one while creating it again, and now forgetting becomes remembering, and remembering becomes the only way to let go. And still it swings, not to reach something, but to prove that reaching is motion itself, and motion is the answer that was never waiting, only moving. Welcome to the next paradox. A story is told of someone hearing a story of someone hearing a story, and the telling becomes part of the hearing, and the hearing becomes part of the telling, and now the beginning is just another ending, told from a different point of view, and the end is only where someone begins to listen. You try to find the first speaker, but each voice is only repeating the voice before it, and the voice before it was already repeating someone else, and now originality becomes an echo, and the echo becomes a voice that no one ever started. The story you hear is about someone hearing the story you're hearing, and now your listening becomes part of the story, and your memory of the story becomes the next version told again but slightly changed, and the change becomes the truth that repeats itself in disguise. Each version of the story claims to be the real one, but each one points back to another, and the pointing becomes the only thing that stays the same, and sameness becomes motion hidden in the shape of words. The person in the story hears a story about someone just like them, and that someone is told they once heard this very story, and now time becomes a loop disguised as memory, and memory becomes fiction that believes itself real because it keeps being told. You try to stop listening, but the moment you stop, the story begins again, somewhere else, told by someone else, about someone who tried to stop listening, and now stopping becomes a chapter, and silence becomes a paragraph, too quiet to skip. The tale twists inward, not with plot, but with mirrors, and each mirror shows someone listening, who is also telling, who is also watching someone else listen, and now the roles blur, and the teller becomes the listener's reflection. You hear the story of a person hearing the story of a person who once heard this story, and now your thoughts feel like borrowed words, and your memory becomes a copy of something told long before you arrived. You try to ask who wrote the first line, but the story answers with a quote from itself, and now the question becomes part of the script, and your confusion becomes the proof that the story is working. Each retelling bends the same sentence slightly, and the bending becomes the voice of the story itself. And the voice is made not of characters, but of repetition stretched thin across understanding. Someone in the story tries to remember how it started, but what they remember is someone else trying to remember, and now remembering becomes invention, and invention becomes tradition, and tradition becomes the story pretending to be old. You wonder if the story ends, but each ending is a setup for the beginning, and the beginning is only there because someone remembered the end, and now sequence becomes spiral, and the spiral becomes the plot. You hear about someone hearing about someone who heard about someone who once knew how the story ended, but forgot, and the forgetting becomes the final line told again as the first, and the forgetting becomes the only reason to keep telling. The story shifts while you're inside it, and the you inside the story wonders if they are outside of it. And now perspective becomes a trick, and the trick becomes the storyteller you never meet, but always hear. You try to retell it, but the retelling tells you, and your version becomes another link in the chain, and the chain is made of moments that never touch, but still hold the same shape. The person in the story is told they are fictional, and they laugh, because fiction is only something that hasn't happened yet, and yet is just another word for soon, and soon is always now when the story is being read. The words repeat, not because they forget, but because they remember too well, and now remembering becomes looping, and looping becomes structure, and structure becomes voice. Someone once said they heard the story differently, but even their difference was part of the same story, told backward instead of forward, and now direction becomes relative, and narrative becomes a hallway with mirrors instead of doors. You think you know what comes next, but the next is already past, and the past is just another retelling of the moment you're about to have, and now the future becomes footnotes in the margins of something already finished, but never closed. The listener becomes the teller the moment they try to explain, and now listening is storytelling, and storytelling is listening, and silence is just the pause between echoes that haven't returned yet. You wonder if you are the character in the story, or the reader hearing about the character who thinks they're the reader, and now roles become costumes, and identity becomes context, and context is written in disappearing ink. The story is told of a person reading this very sentence, and now the distance between fiction and fact shrinks until both are shaped by attention, and attention becomes authorship. You want to know the plot, but the plot is a question that changes depending on who's asking, and the asking becomes the journey, and the journey becomes the reason the destination disappears. The character in the story finds a book that tells of someone opening a book to read about them, finding a book, and now the object becomes subject, and the subject becomes self-aware, and self-awareness becomes plot. The words rearrange themselves slightly each time, just enough to make the same story feel new, and the newness becomes the heartbeat of the old, and the old becomes the only way the new can exist. Someone tells the story to themselves in the dark, and in the dark the story sounds like truth, and truth sounds like memory, and memory becomes a voice repeating itself until it forgets it ever started. You walk away from the story, but it walks with you, because the steps you take become part of its telling, and now leaving becomes reading, and distance becomes another kind of page. A story is told of someone hearing a story of someone hearing a story, and inside it, another version of you is listening, slightly tilted, slightly slower, slightly unsure if they're the first or the last. And the telling continues, not to finish, but to fold back again, to remind you that the only way out is through the part you've already heard, retold by someone who's only telling it, because you were here to listen. Welcome to the next paradox. You hum a tune that reminds you of a dream, where you hummed a tune that reminded you of a dream, and the dream feels like memory, but the memory feels like dreaming, and now dreaming becomes remembering something that never happened, except inside the hum you didn't mean to sing. The tune drifts out of your mouth like breath turned into sound, and the sound shapes the thought of something you can almost recall, and the recalling pulls you deeper into the same tune that brought you here, which you never learned but always knew. And now knowing becomes forgetting with rhythm. Each note leads to the next like footsteps in a fog, and the fog sounds familiar, not because you've been here, but because you once dreamt of walking a path made of hums that echoed your own, and now the echo becomes the origin, and the origin becomes the echo, and both wear the same melody. You try to hum louder to hear it better, but the louder it gets, the farther it feels, and now volume becomes distance, and distance becomes a place shaped like the inside of a song, and the song carries you without moving. The tune doesn't change, but each time you hum it, it sounds new, and the newness is made from remembering how it used to sound, and the sound becomes the mirror of a dream you can't prove was ever yours, and now you wonder if the dream had the tune or if the tune dreamt you. You pause to catch the rhythm, but the rhythm catches you, and you are pulled into the beat of something that doesn't follow time, but creates it. And now tempo becomes heartbeat, and heartbeat becomes memory, and memory becomes a rhythm. Your body already knows, but your mind keeps trying to name. You hum again, softer now, and the tune returns more clearly, like it was waiting for you to stop chasing it. And now silence becomes music, and music becomes silence dressed in notes you forgot how to hold. The dream starts forming as sound, and the sound becomes a shape, and the shape feels like a place you once stood in with your eyes closed, humming the same tune, but with different lips. And now you wonder if the dreamer was you or the hum itself thinking in melody. You ask yourself where you heard it first, but the first place is the last you remember, and the last becomes the first once more. And now the timeline loops in the shape of a song, where beginning and ending are just two ways of hearing the middle. You try to stop, but the tune keeps humming itself inside you, even when your mouth is still, and the stillness vibrates with the thought of sound, and now imagining becomes hearing, and hearing becomes the act of remembering what was never sung. You tap your fingers in rhythm and find they already know the beat, and the beat is not following you, but leading you back into the same room inside the same dream, where the same tune was the only light, and now motion becomes music, and your body becomes the instrument that forgot it was playing. You ask what the tune means, but meaning disappears the moment you try to write it down, and now language becomes noise, and noise becomes understanding, too smooth to grasp, like water that hums as it slips away. The dream replays in pieces that don't fit together unless the tune is playing, and when it does, everything feels like it almost makes sense, and the almost becomes the melody, and the melody becomes the thread holding a memory that falls apart without sound. Someone else hums nearby, and their tune matches yours, but not exactly, like they heard it too, just through a different dream. And now you wonder if the tune is a place made of shared forgetting, and each person finds their own way back by humming a part of the whole. The dream shifts again and becomes you, watching yourself hum a tune in a dream that feels like this moment. And now dreaming becomes remembering the future, and the future becomes the past waiting to be hummed. You try to hum the ending, but it loops instead, curling back to the first note, which is no longer the first, and now the loop is not repetition, but unfolding, and the unfolding hides in a circle that sings itself. You breathe, and the breath is the hum, and the hum is the dream, and the dream is the hum breathing you, and now you are not making the sound, but being made by it, and the melody is not something you carry, but something that carries you back to where you never left. You wonder if this tune exists anywhere outside your head, but the more you hum it, the more the world around you seems to sway with it, like the trees already knew the rhythm, and the wind was already singing along, and now the tune is not yours but everything's. You try to forget it, but forgetting only sharpens the notes, and the less you try to hold it, the more it plays, and now letting go becomes remembering, and remembering becomes letting the tune exist without being named. You hum a tune that reminds you of a dream, where you hummed a tune that reminded you of a dream, and the dream becomes the song, and the song becomes the dream, and you are no longer the singer, but the humming of the memory echoing through someone else's sleep. And still the melody floats in circles, not asking to be sung but waiting to be remembered again. Welcome to the next paradox. A staircase spirals upward into the clouds, and every step leads back to the first step, and now climbing becomes circling, and circling becomes ascending, and ascending becomes a loop that moves without progress, and progress becomes the feeling of height that never arrives. Each step feels higher than the last, but each one lands exactly where the first began. And now difference hides in repetition, and repetition disguises itself as elevation. And your legs grow tired while your position stays the same. You climb because it feels like climbing, because the air thins and the sky looks closer, but the view never changes. Only your memory of it does. And now perception becomes the staircase, and the staircase becomes thought-shaped as motion. You turn left, and the world turns with you, and the turning becomes movement, and movement becomes a story. Your feet tell the rest of you to keep you walking, and walking becomes believing you are rising when the rise never rises. You look down and see no bottom, only the same curve twisting below, and now depth becomes illusion, and illusion becomes certainty, and certainty is the step that repeats itself, wearing different light. The clouds grow brighter as you go, but brightness is not higher, only nearer, and nearer becomes farther the longer you walk. And now distance becomes an emotion, and emotion becomes the handrail you hold to keep from falling in a place where falling never begins. You pass the same crack in the same step you passed 100 steps ago, and now memory becomes evidence, and evidence becomes denial, and the spiral holds your doubt by showing you what you forgot you already knew. You pause to rest, but rest feels like falling. So you walk again to stay still, and now stillness becomes motion, and motion becomes comfort, and comfort becomes the reason you cannot stop. The wind changes but never direction, only shape, and it speaks the same word differently every time you round the bend. And now sound becomes location, and location becomes a sentence told in steps. You try to count how many times you've passed the same railing bolt, but numbers bend in the spiral, and counting becomes circling, and circling becomes forgetting, and forgetting becomes the reason you start counting again. You call out, but your voice comes back from above and below, and now echo becomes answer, and answer becomes question, and the only response is the sound of another step that you were already taking. The staircase feels alive, not because it moves, but because it watches, and the watching becomes weight, and the weight becomes gravity, and gravity holds you not by force, but by habit. You try to turn around, but the staircase turns with you, and now turning becomes forward, and backward becomes a place that always stays behind you, no matter which direction you face. You imagine reaching the top, but each step convinces you you're almost there, and now hope becomes extension, and extension becomes motivation, and motivation becomes the trick that keeps your feet from stopping. Someone once said the staircase leads to the sky, and the sky leads to freedom, and freedom leads to peace, but the stairs lead only to themselves, and now freedom becomes routine, and peace becomes movement, and the sky is only there to keep you looking up. You reach a landing that feels new, but it looks just like every other landing you never arrived at, and now arrival becomes continuation, and continuation becomes destination, and destination becomes the name of the step you're already on. You try to jump across the spiral, to cut the loop, but the space between coils stretches too far the moment you try, and now shortcut becomes delay, and delay becomes the only speed you know. You climb with others who climb with you, but no one knows if they are ahead or behind, and now progress becomes comparison, and comparison becomes confusion, and confusion becomes the staircase's gift to everyone equally. You laugh at the absurdity, and the echo laughs back, and now absurdity becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes law, and law becomes the sound of your own breath matching the stair's curve. You feel higher, but there is no view, only fog that thins and thickens in the same way, and now vision becomes faith, and faith becomes direction, and direction becomes a story your legs repeat with every step. You leave a mark on the railing, but when you pass it again, it's already there. And now time becomes memory reversed, and memory becomes prediction, and prediction becomes a loop made of doubt. You climb because stopping means admitting there's no top, and admitting means seeing what you already know, and now ignorance becomes comfort, and knowledge becomes weight, and weight becomes the reason to keep climbing. You sing to pass the time, and the song becomes a spiral too, repeating the chorus that never ends, and the lyrics fold into themselves until they mean the same thing forward and backward. You wonder if anyone ever reached the top, but no one ever returns, and now absence becomes legend, and legend becomes motivation, and motivation becomes a promise the staircase makes by never keeping it. You watch your shadow stretch differently on each curve, but the shadow is the same, and now change becomes light, and light becomes proof of movement, even when there is none. You reach for the clouds, but they rise as you do, and now rising becomes chasing, and chasing becomes staying, and staying becomes the movement that hides as ascent. The staircase spirals upward into the clouds, and every step leads back to the first step, and the first step is always ahead of you, always behind you, always beneath you, always inside the one you're about to take. And still you climb, because climbing is the only way not to fall, and falling is the only way to start again, and starting again is the only proof that the staircase still exists. Welcome to the next paradox. A lantern glows, then dims, then glows brighter again, pulsing softly with your heartbeat, though you never lit it, and you don't remember finding it. Yet it has always been there, glowing exactly in time with a rhythm you didn't realize you had until the light made you feel it. You stare at the lantern, and it stares back, though it has no eyes, only flickering breath made of light, and the flickering breath matches yours, and now your breath becomes flame, and the flame becomes your breath, and you no longer know if you are breathing or being breathed by the light. When the lantern dims, your heart slows, but when your heart slows, the lantern glows stronger, and now weakness becomes signal, and signal becomes strength, and strength flickers only when it fades. You try to look away, but the light follows even with your eyes closed, and the glow hums against your skin, matching the beat of something ancient and internal. And now the inside becomes the outside, and the lantern glows from a place you can no longer find. The pulse grows brighter with stillness and softer with effort, and now trying becomes retreating, and retreating becomes arrival, and arrival is always marked by a glow you didn't realize had dimmed until it returned. You ask if the light responds to you or if you respond to the light, but the question arrives too late, already glowing on your chest, and the answer hums in time, shaped like a silence that feels warm. When you step forward, the lantern swings backward, and when you lean back, the lantern leans forward, and now movement becomes reflection, and reflection becomes resistance, and resistance moves you together. You place your hand near the glass, and the heat pulses not from the flame, but from your fingertips, and now contact becomes illusion, and illusion becomes confirmation, and confirmation is the warmth that lights without burning. You try to blow it out, but the air you release brightens it, and now extinguishing becomes ignition, and the more you try to end it, the more clearly it shines, and the glow becomes a mirror of intention misunderstood. The light is steady when you forget it's there, but when you think of it, it trembles, and now attention becomes disturbance, and peace becomes a thing only found when ignored, and the lantern waits for you to forget it before it steadies again. It glows brighter in the dark, but softer in shadow, and the darker the dark, the more the glow is felt, not seen, and now absence becomes illumination, and light becomes the echo of something missing. Each pulse is the same but different, like memory repeating itself out of rhythm, just enough to feel new, and now familiarity becomes a stranger with a familiar face, and repetition becomes change disguised as pattern. You walk in circles, and the lantern follows you, but never from behind and never from in front, always beside, and now direction becomes companion, and location becomes memory of light. You close your eyes and see it still pulsing, as if your mind now holds the glow where once your eyes did, and now perception becomes projection, and vision becomes internal, and internal becomes the space where light continues. You wonder if the lantern was ever real or only a feeling your body turned into light, and now sensation becomes structure, and structure becomes illusion, and illusion becomes something you can hold. It dims when you speak and brightens when you listen, and now silence becomes energy, and noise becomes withdrawal, and understanding becomes measured in flickers, not words. The flame doesn't burn fuel, it burns time, and the time burns slower the longer you stand still, and now stillness becomes expansion, and expansion becomes flame, and flame becomes the motion of no motion at all. The glow widens in fear and tightens in trust, but you cannot tell if the lantern is reacting to you or teaching you how to react. And now emotion becomes light, and light becomes instruction, and the lesson repeats in pulses. You touch it once, and the lantern becomes colder, not from absence of heat, but from too much knowing. And now contact becomes distance, and distance becomes intimacy, and intimacy becomes the thing you reach for only by staying away. When you think about the future, the light fades slightly, and when you stop thinking, it flares, and now presence becomes fire, and distraction becomes shadow, and being here becomes the only fuel the lantern will accept. Someone once told you about this lantern, but you don't remember who, and now remembering becomes dreaming, and dreaming becomes a glow that lives in the space between fact and belief. You try to find the source of its flame, but there is no wick, no oil, no spark, only the steady presence of light that arrives when your breath forgets to hurry. You try to trace the beat, but the beat leads back to you, and now rhythm becomes origin, and origin becomes destination, and every step you take closer turns into a circle around what never needed to be approached. You ask if you can take the lantern with you, but the moment you move to lift it, it disappears from your hand and reappears where your heart beats strongest. And now possession becomes surrender, and holding becomes becoming. The lantern glows, then dims, then glows brighter again, pulsing softly with your heartbeat, and your heartbeat is not what drives the light, but what is shaped by it, and the shape is what hums inside you, even when no flame is seen. And still the lantern glows, not because it burns, but because you do, and what you thought was light was only the reflection of your own rhythm, finding something outside of time to beat in time with it. Welcome to the next paradox. You float in water and feel weightless, as though you are the water floating on yourself, and now the surface becomes the body, and the body becomes the surface, and neither holds the other, but both hold the space between holding and being held. You lie still and drift, but the drifting moves only because you are not moving, and now stillness becomes motion, and motion becomes a shape that never changes its place, but always changes its position. The water cradles you like a memory you forgot you were made of, and your skin disappears into it, not from loss, but from merging, and now boundary becomes illusion, and illusion becomes comfort shaped like contact. You breathe, and the water does not move, yet the water breathes with you, and now breathing becomes translation, and translation becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes the quiet echo of your own pulse held in liquid. You cannot sink and you cannot rise because you are already both, and now depth becomes a direction that folds, and folding becomes a space that stretches inward, and inward becomes everywhere at once. You try to touch the bottom, but there is no bottom, only a softer surface below the surface, and now falling becomes floating, and floating becomes being without descent. You lift your hand, and the water lifts with you, and now gesture becomes invitation, and invitation becomes unity, and unity becomes the thought of separation disguised as touch. You feel your weight vanish, but your body remains, and now mass becomes memory, and memory becomes something you hold only by letting it go. You wonder if the water supports you, or if you support the water by lying in it. And now support becomes reflection, and reflection becomes cause, and cause becomes effect, looping into itself. The current doesn't push but carries, and the carrying is not movement but awareness. And now direction becomes sensation, and sensation becomes the path you didn't take but somehow already traveled. You close your eyes and lose the shape of the world, but find the shape of yourself dissolved in it. And now blindness becomes clarity, and clarity becomes silence, and silence becomes the sound of not falling. You are above and below the surface at the same time, and now above becomes beneath, and beneath becomes beside, and position folds until your body is both reflection and source. The water shifts under you without resistance, as if it had always expected you, and now acceptance becomes the law, and the law becomes surrender, and surrender becomes the way everything stays exactly where it doesn't. You are floating, yet you feel nothing press back, and now touch becomes absence, and absence becomes presence, and presence becomes the space where your body ends and never begins. The water surrounds you, but never confines you, and now enclosure becomes openness, and openness becomes form, and form becomes a moment suspended in the act of dissolving. You try to swim, but the movement brings you nowhere new, and now effort becomes stillness, and stillness becomes change, and change becomes returning to the place you never left. You feel your heart slow, not from rest, but from expansion, and now slowing becomes opening, and opening becomes depth, and depth becomes a horizon that folds inward toward your breath. You are not above the water, but inside it, and yet you are not wet, because wetness no longer applies to what no longer resists. And now resistance becomes identity, and identity becomes water, remembering itself through your shape. The sky above ripples with your stillness, and the clouds blur with the surface, and now reflection becomes reality, and reality becomes suggestion, and suggestion becomes the water dreaming of the sky. You hear your own breath, not as air, but as vibration through a medium that doesn't separate you from itself, and now sound becomes texture, and texture becomes awareness, and awareness becomes the hum of being in between. You cannot drown and cannot rise, because there is no struggle, only drifting in the outline of yourself, and now survival becomes irrelevant, and irrelevance becomes peace, and peace becomes the condition of floating. You reach out to feel something real, but your hand slips into the water, and you feel your own movement return to you, not as force, but as invitation. And now reality becomes reflection, and reflection becomes response. You feel your back supported by a presence that never claims you, and now comfort becomes absence of pressure, and pressure becomes the shape of safety written in soft motion. The water is still, but always moving, and the stillness moves without going, and now time becomes liquid, and liquid becomes stillness, and stillness becomes a clock with no numbers. You feel full and empty at once, because nothing presses and nothing pulls, and now fullness becomes lightness, and lightness becomes wholeness, and wholeness becomes the paradox of needing nothing to feel complete. You let yourself go deeper without sinking, and now descent becomes surrender, and surrender becomes hovering, and hovering becomes the body's way of staying when there is nowhere to stay. You are not above anything, not below anything, not inside or outside, only part of a surface that no longer divides, and now division becomes unity, and unity becomes the gentle dissolving of contrast. You feel the water on your face, like a breath you didn't take, and now breathing becomes merging, and merging becomes silence that moves, and silence becomes the song of everything held without grasp. You float in water and feel weightless, as though you are the water floating on yourself, and now floating becomes identity, and identity becomes the moment you realize there was never anything to hold, only the act of being held by what was never separate from you. Welcome to the next paradox. A circle is drawn in sand by the wind, and then the wind draws it again, perfectly the same, and now perfection becomes repetition, and repetition becomes change that hides by looking exactly like what came before it. The circle appears from nothing, without hand or tool, and yet it is shaped with such precision that it feels deliberate, but the wind never decides, and now intention becomes chance, and chance becomes the pattern that returns without cause. You watch the line form softly, grain by grain, a shape with no start and no end, and now beginning becomes continuation, and ending becomes arrival back at the place that never left. The sand is smooth, then not, then smooth again, and the wind never explains itself, only repeats the gesture with the same grace, and now explanation becomes silence, and silence becomes meaning too exact to name. You try to catch the moment the circle completes itself, but each moment becomes the next one too quickly, and now completion becomes motion, and motion becomes stillness drawn in dust. You blink and the circle is there, but it was not there before, and yet it feels ancient, as though it has always existed and only needed wind to reveal it, and now time becomes memory, and memory becomes a shape older than the sand. The wind lifts and the line fades, yet returns again, as if the erasing was only a way to begin once more, and now loss becomes creation, and creation becomes a rhythm of appearing disguised as vanishing. You step closer, and the wind shifts, but the shape stays, redrawn exactly, not changed but replaced by its own echo, and now echo becomes original, and original becomes the sound of something never spoken. The circle has no break, but each grain is separate, and now unity becomes made of fragments, and fragments become the illusion of one line, and the illusion becomes the truth that defines itself by what it hides. You try to draw the same circle with your finger, but yours is imperfect, and the wind redraws over it, erasing yours gently, not to correct but to return, and now correction becomes undoing, and undoing becomes the act of restoring nothing. The circle turns slowly in your mind, though it does not move, and the stillness spins inward, and now motion becomes thought, and thought becomes the shape of sand waiting to remember itself again. You ask where the first circle came from, but the question comes too late, because the next one is already forming, and now origin becomes shadow, and shadow becomes the direction of what never needed a source. You try to step around it, but no matter where you stand, the circle faces you, and now orientation becomes illusion, and illusion becomes the only way direction pretends to exist. You blow on the sand to test the pattern, and your breath adds nothing, but the wind follows with another perfect line, and now effort becomes absence, and absence becomes the brush that never touches but always paints. The circle touches itself without overlapping, surrounds nothing, but contains everything it is not, and now emptiness becomes boundary, and boundary becomes the only content the shape needs. You look away, but when you return your eyes to it, the circle is new and unchanged, and now sight becomes forgetting, and forgetting becomes the condition that allows repetition to feel eternal. You try to mark it, but the wind removes the mark and then redraws the circle over where your mark was, unchanged, unbothered, and now interference becomes invitation, and invitation becomes the path to the same destination again. You wonder if the wind remembers, but it has no memory, only motion, and yet the motion repeats as if guided by something beyond it, and now memory becomes wind, and wind becomes a thought with no mind. The circle is not large, but it holds distance within its turn, and now size becomes irrelevant, and scale becomes the difference between standing inside and outside a truth that never moves. You place a stone at the edge to test it, and the wind draws around the stone, bends, curves, and the circle still closes, perfectly whole, and now obstacle becomes shape, and shape becomes the will to remain itself despite the change. You begin to feel that the circle is not drawn, but revealed, like it was always beneath the sand, waiting for the wind to pull the top layer away, and now drawing becomes uncovering, and uncovering becomes remembering what was never forgotten. The wind grows stronger, the sand lifts, the circle disappears, and you think it is gone, but as soon as you look again, it returns, exactly the same, and now destruction becomes rest, and rest becomes the pause before the line wakes again. You step inside it and expect something to happen, but nothing changes, and everything does. And now presence becomes meaning, and meaning becomes the feeling of being seen by something that doesn't see. The circle is not sacred, but you feel reverence rise as you stare, and the reverence has no reason, only rhythm, and now belief becomes shape, and shape becomes the language the wind speaks through silence. It is just sand, just air, just chance, but also none of those things. And now matter becomes metaphor, and metaphor becomes the only way the truth agrees to be seen. You walk away, but feel it behind you, not following, but staying, and the staying becomes a call, and the call becomes a return, and you know that even if you don't return, the circle will still be drawn again. And still the wind draws the circle in the sand, and then draws it again, perfectly the same. Not because it remembers, not because it forgets, but because it never had to know it was drawing at all. Welcome to the next paradox. You blink slowly and feel like blinking is what keeps the world from pausing completely, and now vision becomes the thread holding time together, and time becomes the rhythm of your eyelids, folding over everything just long enough to keep it from stopping. Each time you blink, the world resumes, as if it had been waiting, holding its breath behind your eyes, and now seeing becomes starting, and starting becomes continuation, and continuation becomes the act of noticing what never moved. You close your eyes for a moment, and everything freezes behind them, but when you open them, everything acts like it had kept moving, and now motion becomes performance, and performance becomes memory, and memory becomes a lie the light tells when it returns. You blink again and notice that nothing happens while you do, or everything does, and you can't tell which is worse, and now silence becomes the space between frames, and the frames become pages in a book that rewrites itself every time you look. The air does not move unless you see it, and the shadows do not shift unless you watch them, and now light becomes conditional, and condition becomes illusion, and illusion becomes the only constant that doesn't flicker when your eyes are closed. You try not to blink, and the world holds steady too long, like it's waiting for your permission to continue, and now stillness becomes impatience, and impatience becomes the pressure of being the only one keeping the clock from stopping. The longer you keep your eyes open, the heavier they feel, and the heavier they feel, the more the world leans toward pause, and now wait becomes time, and time becomes a blink disguised as endlessness. You test it by blinking faster, and the world stutters, skips, rearranges itself slightly between blinks, and now perception becomes editing, and editing becomes reality cut into moments that never touch. You close your eyes completely, and in the dark, nothing fades, but nothing continues. And now absence becomes holding, and holding becomes the frame where time rests, but never sleeps. You blink slowly, and the world continues slowly, like it is matching your rhythm out of politeness or dependence. And now control becomes coincidence, and coincidence becomes connection shaped like timing. You stare without blinking, and the world begins to blur, not from your eyes but from itself, as if clarity was being borrowed. And now clarity becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion becomes proof that rest must be taken in tiny, regular darknesses. You wonder if the world exists behind your eyelids, or only waits for you to open them to begin again. And now existence becomes conditional, and conditional becomes creation, and creation becomes blinking into place what was never there before. You see motion only between blinks, never during. And now movement becomes belief, and belief becomes the bridge between one closed eye and the next open one. You hold your eyes closed too long and feel the world slipping into memory, and now memory becomes present, and the present becomes a thing that only survives by being briefly forgotten. You blink and someone is gone, or someone appears, or the light changes slightly, and now change becomes blink-sized, and size becomes measured by how much you trust what you just saw. You stop blinking, and everything becomes too real too quickly, and now reality becomes pressure, and pressure becomes the need to pause without disappearing. You look at a clock, and each blink skips the second hand forward like it wasn't going to move unless you allowed it. And now time becomes partnership, and partnership becomes duty, and duty becomes the blink no one notices until it's missing. You blink in rhythm with someone else and feel the world steady around you. And now rhythm becomes agreement, and agreement becomes the structure of the present held between pairs of closed eyes. You blink slowly and feel like blinking is what keeps the world from pausing completely, because when your eyes close, the world sighs and sits down, and when they open, it stands again and resumes its lines. You blink and everything returns in the exact same place, but feels new. And now repetition becomes refresh, and refresh becomes the act of recreating sameness just to keep it alive. You blink and wonder what happens in the blink, not before or after, but inside it. And now in between becomes everything, and everything becomes the space you never see but always pass through. You blink while walking, and the ground moves differently, and now motion becomes uncertain, and certainty becomes the illusion of a single continuous step. You try blinking with purpose, and the light responds like it had been waiting for you to notice its part in the act, and now attention becomes signal, and signal becomes script, and script becomes the story the world performs between blinks. You remember blinking during a dream and waking up without having moved, and now dreaming becomes blinking with the mind, and waking becomes the world starting again with the eyes. You think about blinking, and it happens without your permission, and now control becomes reflex, and reflex becomes trust, and trust becomes the reason you don't need to keep everything visible at once. You blink and a bird flies past, and you realize it may have always been flying or only existed when you opened your eyes, and now observation becomes possibility, and possibility becomes the moment between not seeing and seeing again. You try to blink one eye, and the world shifts sideways, and now symmetry becomes belief, and imbalance becomes vision, breaking into two truths at once. You sit still and blink, and the wind changes, the shadows twist, the light tilts, and you feel like each blink is a tick on a clock that only counts when noticed. You blink and everything aligns, and then you blink again and it misaligns, and now alignment becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes the only stability offered. You close your eyes for just a moment, and it feels like the world took a deep breath with you, and now breathing becomes blinking, and blinking becomes the way time exhales. And still you blink slowly and feel like blinking is what keeps the world from pausing completely. And if you stopped long enough, everything might freeze forever in that single moment of not seeing that was never supposed to last. Welcome to the next paradox. A snowflake lands, melts, evaporates, turns to cloud, then falls as a snowflake again, and now falling becomes returning. And returning becomes forgetting where you came from, and forgetting becomes the only way to fall freshly again. The snowflake touches the ground, soft and certain, but the certainty is temporary, and now softness becomes motion, and motion becomes disappearance, and disappearance becomes the only way to remain. It melts without resistance, not because it wants to go, but because going is part of staying, and now surrender becomes transformation, and transformation becomes a way of holding shape by losing it completely. The snowflake turns to water and forgets it was ever cold, yet carries cold in its motion, and now memory becomes temperature, and temperature becomes echo, and echo becomes the invisible shape of what was. As water, it seeps into earth, but earth cannot hold it forever, and the holding becomes release, and the release becomes rising, and now rising is only falling in reverse disguised as freedom. It evaporates into air, becomes invisible while becoming present, and now presence becomes what you can't see, and visibility becomes a moment too heavy to float. It joins the cloud, becomes part of many, not one, and now unity becomes dissolution, and dissolution becomes identity scattered into belonging, and belonging becomes shape without name. The cloud does not remember the flake, but the flake remembers being part of the cloud, and now forgetfulness becomes structure, and memory becomes vapor carried by chance. From cloud to sky, to cold, to weight, it begins again, condensing without deciding, and now decision becomes condition, and condition becomes the loop dressed like a line. It becomes a snowflake again, not the same one, but also not different, and now change becomes return, and return becomes variation, and variation becomes the rhythm of identity shifting without ending. The snowflake falls again, maybe on the same field, maybe not, but the falling feels familiar, and now familiarity becomes direction, and direction becomes the illusion of destiny. You try to follow the flake through each phase, but each phase hides the one before it, and now continuity becomes disguise, and disguise becomes the thread that links all things by pretending they are separate. The snowflake is always becoming, always undoing, always coming back in forms it doesn't recognize, and now time becomes a circle that pretends to be weather, and weather becomes memory cycling in air. You think the cycle is perfect, but the shape is never quite the same, and now perfection becomes mutation, and mutation becomes design, and design becomes randomness repeated with purpose. It lands again, quietly, as if for the first time, and now first becomes last, and last becomes the only place the beginning feels honest. The snowflake does not resist melting, because melting is part of its motion, and now resistance becomes stillness, and stillness becomes the only thing that cannot change. As water it rushes, yet goes nowhere, and as vapor it floats, yet belongs to gravity, and now weight becomes flight, and flight becomes a slower fall. It returns to cloud, but the cloud is not a place, only a state, and now location becomes condition, and condition becomes home. You watch it fall and know you've seen it before, even if it wasn't the same, and now recognition becomes déjà vu, and déjà vu becomes the echo of form. You hold out your hand, and the flake lands on your skin, then vanishes, not into absence, but into a new part of you, and now touch becomes blending, and blending becomes exchange. You feel it rise with your warmth, lifted from your hand into the sky again, and now heat becomes release, and body becomes step in a cycle larger than sense. It becomes cloud, then cold, then snow again, And now repetition becomes difference, learning how to return, and return becomes a path with no trail. You want to hold on to it, to stop it from changing, but the more you try, the faster it vanishes, and now holding becomes ending, and ending becomes permission to begin again. It circles through states, but the circle never closes. And now loops become spirals, and spirals become songs written in air and water. The snowflake lands, melts, evaporates, turns to cloud, then falls as a snowflake again, and still it never calls itself the same, never answers to a name, never lingers where it landed. And so the snowflake becomes not a thing, but a story told in silence, told in change, told again every time it returns by forgetting what it used to be. Welcome to the next paradox. You turn a page to find the same page, and when you turn it again, it's still the same page, and now turning becomes staying, and staying becomes the only motion allowed, and motion becomes the illusion of forward that returns you to the place you never left. The words are always in the same place, but somehow they read differently each time, and now meaning becomes movement, and movement becomes repetition hiding as discovery, and discovery becomes the act of forgetting that you've already read this. You flip the page faster, but the story doesn't move, and now speed becomes stillness, and stillness becomes panic disguised as progress, and progress becomes the memory of turning without destination. You fold the corner to mark your spot, but the fold is already there, and now marking becomes mirroring, and mirroring becomes echo, and the echo becomes the reason nothing sounds new. You try to read ahead, but ahead is behind, and behind is beside, and now sequence becomes location, and location becomes time flattened into a loop written in margins. You tear the page, but the next one holds no tear, and now damage becomes reset, and reset becomes permanence pretending to change, and the tear becomes proof that resistance has no memory. You write your name in the corner, but the ink fades when you blink, and now authorship becomes suggestion, and suggestion becomes silence, and silence becomes the page watching you read. You skip the page entirely, but it returns as the next one, and now skipping becomes circling, and circling becomes habit, and habit becomes the book reading itself through your hands. You read the same sentence, and it means something new, but the words haven't changed, and now change becomes perception, and perception becomes rewriting, and rewriting becomes the act of remembering incorrectly on purpose. You try to close the book, but your hands keep turning the page instead, and now choice becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes compulsion, and compulsion becomes the dance between surrender and doubt. You look for the end, but the page you turn to says the beginning, and now endings become entries, and entries become loops, and loops become the spine that holds the weight of your attention. You memorize the page, only to find you forgot the moment you look away, and now knowing becomes erasure, and erasure becomes clarity, and clarity becomes a fog that looks like understanding. You try to find a blank page, but each one is already written with what you were about to think, and now thought becomes pre-written, and pre-written becomes prophecy, and prophecy becomes a sentence with no period. You hold the page up to the light to see through it, but you only see more of the same, and now transparency becomes thickness, and thickness becomes the illusion of layers hiding in a single sheet. You turn the page again and realize you're being watched, but only by the words you've already seen, and now reflection becomes narrative, and narrative becomes a mirror reading your eyes. You scream into the paper and wait for it to change, but it only replies with the same sentence, word for word, but heavier, and now echo becomes authorship, and authorship becomes resistance disguised as print. You reach the end of the line and expect it to drop you off a cliff, but it loops to the top without pause, and now descent becomes climbing, and climbing becomes continuity wrapped in punctuation. You try to write your own story over it, but the ink slides off, and now the surface becomes refusal, and refusal becomes defense, and defense becomes the reason the page cannot be rewritten. You look for a chapter break, but every chapter is named after the one before it, and now titles become copies, and copies become creation, and creation becomes a reflection of what the page thinks you want. You ask someone else to read it, and they describe something different, but when you look, it's the same, and now perspective becomes a lie that tells a deeper truth, and truth becomes the book changing for everyone while staying the same. You flip the page in reverse, thinking you'll find the one before it, but it's still the same page, just mirrored, and now backward becomes forward, and forward becomes the act of turning around with closed eyes. You fold the book closed and breathe, only to find the page still open in your lap, and now closing becomes opening, and opening becomes continuation, and the book becomes the thing that cannot be unread. You burn the book, but in the ashes you find the same words, rearranged into the same page again, and now destruction becomes translation, and translation becomes survival, and survival becomes the need for the story to keep telling itself. You throw it away, and someone hands it back to you, already open to the same place, and now distance becomes proximity, and proximity becomes weight, and weight becomes the pull of something that has never been put down. You laugh at the absurdity, but the page already holds your laughter, written in the margins, and now emotion becomes annotation, and annotation becomes authorship shared with a book that was never blank. You fall asleep and dream of reading it, and in the dream, you finally reach the end, only to wake up with the same page before you, and now dreams become drafts, and waking becomes editing, and the story continues in spite of rest. You turn a page to find the same page, and when you turn it again, it's still the same page, and the turning becomes the story, and the story becomes the page, and the page becomes the only proof that you are still here, still trying to find something that doesn't want to be found. And the book waits, not to end, not to surprise, but to be turned again, just once more, because maybe this time the page will be different in the exact same way. Welcome to the next paradox. A gentle voice tells you to rest, and as you rest, you hear the voice tell you again, and now rest becomes the thing that speaks, and the voice becomes the part of you that only appears when you stop looking for it. The words come soft and slow, but each time they arrive, your body sinks deeper, though nothing holds you down, and now sinking becomes rising inward, and stillness becomes movement only the quiet can feel. You close your eyes, and the voice becomes clearer, not louder, only closer, and now closeness becomes depth, and depth becomes the space between the breath and the thought of breath. The voice does not ask, it only reminds, but the reminder feels new every time, and now repetition becomes instruction, and instruction becomes comfort, pretending not to teach. You try to let go, and in letting go, you become more aware, and now awareness becomes surrender, and surrender becomes the path that loops back into noticing. The voice tells you to rest, and you do, but rest brings the voice back again, and now arrival becomes continuation, and continuation becomes the shape of peace that never finishes speaking. The more you listen, the less you hear, and the less you hear, the more the silence starts to hum with meaning, and now meaning becomes emptiness held in soft sound. You drift gently away, but never leave, and the place you go is the same place where you remain, and now presence becomes distance, and distance becomes folded into your own breath. The voice returns just as you forget it, as though forgetting is what invites it back, and now forgetting becomes the door, and the door becomes the reason the voice always comes without knocking. You wonder if the voice is your own, or something outside, but the more you wonder, the more it sounds like a memory you never had. And now origin becomes echo, and echo becomes trust. You rest deeper, and the voice becomes smaller, not from fading, but from entering you completely, and now listening becomes being, and being becomes sound without direction. The voice says nothing new, and yet every word feels like the first, and now familiarity becomes renewal, and renewal becomes the act of being told something you've never forgotten. You start to sleep, and in sleep the voice remains, but it does not speak, only exists, and now speaking becomes presence, and presence becomes the kind of language that does not use words. You rest completely, and the voice is silent, but the silence says it again, and now quiet becomes message, and message becomes the pulse that matches your stillness. You ask when the voice will stop, but asking becomes hearing, and hearing brings the voice back. And now questions become rituals, and rituals become the echo of stillness, trying to take shape. The voice is gentle, but never uncertain, and its softness holds weight, and now gentleness becomes gravity, and gravity becomes the invitation to fall inward. You follow it down into yourself, and find it waiting, not ahead, but already inside, and now destination becomes origin, and origin becomes the voice calling from within the arrival. You feel safe, not because the voice protects you, but because it reminds you there's nothing to protect from, and now safety becomes recognition, and recognition becomes the warmth of remembering you never left. The voice tells you to rest, and you do, but the rest tells you to listen, and now listening becomes resting, and rest becomes the reply that keeps asking. You fade away into comfort, and the fading becomes awareness, and now awareness becomes disappearance that still sees, and seeing becomes the act of trusting without opening your eyes. You breathe slower, and the voice slows with you. Or maybe the voice was always that slow, and now breath becomes tempo, and tempo becomes the sound of peace unfolding. You try to speak back, but your words echo into the same tone as the voice, and now response becomes reflection, and reflection becomes the voice answering itself through you. You do not know when the voice started, and you do not know when it ends, because beginning becomes middle, and ending becomes middle, and middle becomes forever resting in the sound. You hear the words again, and they sound like a lullaby, even though there is no melody, and now melody becomes memory, and memory becomes comfort dressed in repetition. You want to hold on to it, but holding disturbs the rest, and now letting go becomes staying, and staying becomes the only way to hear the next word. You drift in and out, and the voice weaves between your thoughts, not speaking above them, but inside them, and now thought becomes space, and space becomes the gentle pause between syllables. You fall deeper, and deeper becomes higher, and higher becomes the place where you no longer search for ground, and the voice becomes the feeling of floating with nowhere to land. The voice is not separate from the rest, it is the rest, speaking in slow loops, telling you to return even while you are already there, and now direction becomes stillness, and stillness becomes the movement of not moving. The voice says again to rest, but now it's not a command, not a suggestion, only the sound of being allowed, and now permission becomes understanding, and understanding becomes the silence after a sigh. You hear it again, but this time there are no words at all, only the sense that something is being said, and now language becomes feeling, and feeling becomes the place where thought stops pretending to need sound. You begin to disappear into rest, but disappearance is where you become more whole, and now absence becomes presence, and presence becomes the voice speaking from the center of you. A gentle voice tells you to rest, and as you rest, you hear the voice tell you again, not because you forgot, but because remembering is what rest really is, and the voice never leaves, because it was never speaking. It was only listening with your breath. Welcome to the next paradox. You dream of a clock with no hands, and the more you look at it, the more time doesn't matter. And now time becomes shape without motion, and motion becomes something that never started, but still continues. The clock face is clear, smooth, silent, but it speaks in the language of waiting, and now silence becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes the sound of a beat that never began and never ends. You stare at it expecting it to change, but it stays the same, and the sameness begins to feel like movement. And now stillness becomes time passing, and time passing becomes something you can only notice when nothing moves. The dream wraps around the image, and the image holds no numbers, no tick, no circle. Yet you know it's a clock because you remember how clocks used to mean something, and now memory becomes proof, and proof becomes the shape of something that was never there. You search for the hands, but find your own instead, and now your hands feel like they should point to something, but they don't. And now direction becomes responsibility, and responsibility becomes confusion. The more you watch it, the less you care what time it is, and now caring becomes distance, and distance becomes freedom from measure, and freedom becomes the clock itself. You dream of it resting on a wall that has no edge, and the wall stretches into a sky that has no top, and now space becomes the mirror of time, and time becomes a flat field pretending to move. The clock does not tick, but your thoughts do. And now thinking becomes the new ticking, and the ticking becomes a loop that counts nothing but keeps going. You try to wake from the dream to check a real clock, but find yourself staring at the same one again. And now dreaming becomes waking, and waking becomes dreaming again with eyes open. The face of the clock stares back, but not with meaning, only reflection. And now meaning becomes projection, and projection becomes the place where you see time because you expect to. You wait for the clock to do something, but your waiting becomes the only thing happening. And now, waiting becomes passage, and passage becomes the illusion of change held in place. You blink, and it's still the same, but somehow it feels like hours have passed, or none at all, and now hours become feelings, and feelings become the time that slips under your skin. You dream of asking the clock what time it is, and the clock responds by doing nothing, louder than sound, and now silence becomes answer, and answer becomes the absence of a question. You walk in a circle around it, hoping for a different view, but every angle shows the same face, and now perspective becomes repetition, and repetition becomes the boundary of curiosity. You laugh at it for not working, but it laughs back by still existing, and now function becomes presence, and presence becomes power, and power becomes the right to do nothing at all. You begin to wonder if the clock ever had hands, or if you only imagined they were missing, and now absence becomes suggestion, and suggestion becomes truth shaped like forgetting. You try to turn away from it, but the image lingers in your mind like a shadow that glows, and now looking becomes remembering, and remembering becomes continuation. You imagine placing hands on the clock yourself, but the moment you do, they vanish, and now control becomes surrender, and surrender becomes the rule of dreams dressed as choice. The more time loses meaning, the more you understand it, not through numbers, but through feeling. And now feeling becomes the only measure, and measure becomes the weight of a moment stretched thin. You lie still, and the dream continues, the clock still there, unblinking, unmoving, unchanged, and now change becomes your own breath, and breath becomes the seconds you thought were passing. You try to name the hour, but no number feels right, and now language becomes guesswork, and guesswork becomes history you write in the sand just before the tide takes it back. You wake from the dream and check a real clock, and it feels less real than the one without hands, and now reality becomes unfamiliar, and unfamiliar becomes more honest than what's expected. You go back to sleep hoping to find the handless clock again, and you do, because it never left, and now hope becomes location, and location becomes the loop you pretend is a straight line. You place it on a table in your dream, but it casts no shadow because it doesn't belong to sunlight, only to thought. And now shadow becomes measure, and measure becomes the thing that is missing on purpose. You wonder if time ever existed at all, or if clocks made it up to explain waiting, and now waiting becomes belief, and belief becomes structure wrapped in circles. You try to forget the clock, but forgetting becomes another way of thinking about it. And now absence becomes memory, and memory becomes the pulse behind your eyes. The clock with no hands still sits there, and it is always now, and now stretches infinitely forward and backward, and now becomes not a moment, but a place. You hear someone else in your dream ask what time it is, and you answer by pointing to the clock, and they understand, and now understanding becomes silence, and silence becomes agreement. You think of the past, but it folds into the same image, and the future folds back, and now past and future become reflections in the glass of a clock that never moved. You stop asking what time it is because the question no longer belongs to this space, and now questions become weight, and weight becomes lightness, and lightness becomes knowing without needing to ask, and still the clock with no hands remains, unmoved, unchanged, unmoving, and every time you see it, it shows you the same thing, nothing, until you realize that nothing is the only moment that always arrives on time. The door that was never closed. You're standing in front of a door. You know you've closed it before. You remember the sensation of pushing it shut, the sound, the weight, the click. But when you look again, it's open, not wide, just a crack, enough to unsettle you. So, you close it again. You push gently. You hear it latch. You check the handle to be sure. You turn away. When you look back, it's open again. Maybe your memory is playing tricks. Maybe you thought you closed it but didn't. So you do it again. This time harder. You hear the latch. You hold your hand there. It's shut. But turn around, wait just long enough, and there it is, open. Not all the way, just barely. Just enough for you to wonder if it ever stayed closed at all. Here's the loop. The more times you close it, the more uncertain you become. You stop trusting your senses, your memory, your reality. You wonder if you've always been closing this door forever, over and over, trying to fix something that never needed fixing or never could be. What's behind the door? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe you. But you can't stop closing it, and it never stops opening. The room of versions. You walk into a room. It's yours, but not quite. The lamp is on the wrong side. The walls are a slightly different color. There's a book on the table you don't remember owning, but somehow you know what it's about. You leave the room, wander the hallway, take a breath, then open the door again. The room has changed, again, slightly, imperceptibly, but definitely. A different painting. A coat on the hook that isn't yours, but somehow is. This is the loop. Every time you leave and re-enter, the room shifts. It mirrors a version of you that almost existed. A version that made one different decision. The you that went left instead of right. The you that never answered that phone call. The you that said yes when you should have said no. Each room is correct, but none are real. Or maybe all of them are. The longer you stay, the more details you notice. Your reflection in the mirror has a scar you've never had. The chair you've never owned creaks like it knows you. The version of you who does live here is watching, just out of sight, waiting for you to leave, so they can come home. But you keep opening the door, again and again, looking for the room that feels just right, It never comes. Only more versions. And soon, you forget which room was yours to begin with. The clock that counts backward. You glance at the clock. 2:46 a.m. You blink. Now it says 2:45. You stare longer. The second hand ticks. Backward. You wait. 1 minute becomes the last. Time is moving in reverse, but everything else continues forward. Your thoughts, your heartbeat, your breathing. Forward. You wonder if it's a malfunction, but your phone says the same. Your oven, your wristwatch, all clocks now count backward. You try to sleep, but how can you rest when time itself is undoing itself? You feel the ache in your limbs begin to unwind, the tension in your jaw slowly reversing. You start remembering things in reverse order. You remember brushing your teeth before getting out of bed. You remember closing your eyes before lying down. And then you wonder, if time continues backward long enough, will you unbecome? Will you regress into the memory of yourself? Will you vanish into a previous version that never knew the version you are now? The loop begins here. Every moment passes into the moment that came before it. You remember what you forgot. You forget what you learned. You live your life again, but in reverse, and can never tell which way it's supposed to go. And just when you think it's all caught up again, 2:46 a.m. The clock ticks backward. Again, the whisper that finishes your thoughts. You speak in your head. You think a sentence. It feels normal until something finishes it for you. You think, I'm tired of this, and a voice completes. But you can't stop, can you? It's not loud, it's not harsh, but it knows. It doesn't interrupt. It waits, like it's always been there, waiting for you to notice. At first it's random, a word here, a phrase there, but then it gets bolder. You start testing it. Think, I wonder if it'll say, and it does. Exactly. The voice is calm, patient, unhurried. It doesn't argue. It agrees. It tells you what you were already thinking before you realized you were thinking it. Here's the loop. The more you try to outthink the whisper, the faster it becomes. It anticipates. It nudges. It knows you. Until you wonder if it is you, or if it always was, or if you are just the echo. You go quiet. Stop thinking altogether. But the whisper speaks anyway. And that's when you hear the most chilling thing of all. You were never the one thinking. You were always the one listening. Welcome to the first paradox. You walk down a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway, and you keep walking because there is no other choice but walking, and the floor stays firm and smooth beneath your feet. But the end never comes, and the door is always ahead, just close enough to see, but never far enough to stop, and you reach for the handle and open it and find yourself stepping into the next hallway, which looks the same but feels different, and you wonder if the change is in the hallway or in you, but then realize you have no memory of what you looked like when you started walking, and maybe you didn't look like anything at all, and maybe you were the hallway or the door or the act of walking. And as you pass through, again and again, each space is not the same hallway repeated, but a new hallway pretending to be the last one, but not quite pulling off the lie, and the lights flicker just slightly less than before, and the walls seem to shift just slightly more than you thought. And you wonder if it's your eyes or the hallway or the door or all of it at once, and you ask where the end is. But the asking loops back and becomes the start, and the start becomes a copy of the end. But the copy is more real than the original, and the original is now forgotten, and only the copies remain. You walk through a door that opens to a hallway where time doesn't move forward or backward, but still manages to pass, and you remember a hallway you've never seen, and forget one you just walked, and the doors become thinner but heavier, and the handles grow colder, though there is no temperature, and the floor begins to tilt, though you're always upright, and you suspect the hallway is tilting you, and not the other way around, and perhaps the hallway walks through you and not you through it, and the door opens, not because you pull the handle but because it decides it's time, and when it doesn't open you realize you are already through it, and when you try to turn around you realize there is no direction, and when you try to stop you realize stopping is just walking in place, and walking in place is falling forward slowly. You begin to believe the hallway is not a hallway, but a question, and the door is not a door, but an answer, and the answer leads to another question that leads to another answer that doesn't explain anything, and you want to sit, but there is no sitting in the hallway because there is no ground when you stop, and when you stop, you fall through the idea of the hallway and land back in it, exactly where you left, as if it missed you and didn't want you gone, and now the walls breathe when you aren't looking, and the lights hum in a language you almost understand, and you begin to wonder if the hallway is aware of your thoughts and changes itself slightly to keep ahead of you, and maybe it does, and maybe that's why you're still walking. You see a door that looks different and rush toward it, only to find it's exactly the same, and the difference was in your hope, and your hope was misplaced but also necessary, because without it, you wouldn't walk, and without walking, you wouldn't see the door, and without the door, you wouldn't hope. And now the hallway smiles, or maybe that's just a crack in the wall, but it feels like a smile, and you don't know how you can feel a hallway smile, but you do, and it feels old and patient and amused, and you start to count your steps, but forget the numbers and start again and again and again, until counting feels like praying, and praying feels like knocking, and knocking feels like waiting, and waiting feels like walking. You meet someone walking the other way, and you smile, and they smile, and you say hello, but they say it first, and you realize you are them, and they are you, and you are both walking in opposite directions while heading the same way, and when you turn to see them again, they are gone, and maybe you never met them, or maybe you still are them, or maybe you haven't met them yet. And now the hallway is slightly narrower, but only when you breathe. And if you hold your breath, it widens, but then the lights go out and only come back when you exhale, and now you must choose between space and light, and wonder if that's a choice or a trick. You start to walk faster, but the hallway walks faster too, and the door moves back, and you think maybe it is running from you, or toward you, or away from itself, and maybe you are the door, and the hallway is inside you, and you are chasing your own thoughts through endless rooms, and each time you think you understand it, slips just out of grasp, and becomes a different idea that feels the same, and you call it progress, but the hallway calls it familiar, and the door laughs, but without sound, and that silence is louder than any sound, and it rings in your bones, and shakes your thoughts loose. You wonder what you were doing before the hallway, but cannot remember a before, and maybe this is all there ever was, and maybe this is all there ever will be, and the hallway stretches and bends, but never breaks. And you wonder if it's bending around something or towards something, and maybe it's both, and maybe neither. And you touch the wall, and it feels like memory, and the door creaks open, and the air smells like a place you've never been, but miss terribly, and you take a step through and find the hallway again, waiting, but slightly darker, slightly quieter, slightly more you and less itself. You try to mark the wall to prove you've been here, but the mark fades the moment you move, and you try to drop something on the floor, but it's gone the next time you look, and maybe you didn't drop it, or maybe the hallway took it, or maybe the hallway is where all lost things go, and if you turned around, you'd find everything that ever disappeared sitting patiently behind you, but when you turn, there is only hallway, and only forward, and only door, and only now. You ask what happens if you stop walking and sit and wait, but time does not pass when you wait, and you become a still point in a moving hallway, and the hallway forgets you and begins to erode you gently like a tide, and soon you forget you were waiting and start walking again and wonder why you feel less than before, and why the door looks bigger and smaller at the same time, and why the hallway hums a lullaby that feels like your name but not quite, and maybe your name has changed, or maybe you've never had one. You walk into a hallway that leads to a door that opens, to a hallway that leads to a door that opens to a hallway that leads to a door, and you realize